Roland took a deep breath as the storm eagle screeched, the piercing sound causing the very air around him to vibrate. He steadied his stance, his hammer glowing faintly as it drew upon his mana. The weapon had been designed not only to channel his mana for spellcasting but also to function as a conventional weapon, something he had neglected to use it as. This was one of his weaknesses, his heavy reliance on his creations and the magical damage they could inflict. But what if he found himself unable to use them? Would he still be able to survive? Let's see how well I do without my gear. His voice was barely audible over the roaring winds as he approached the monster, holding a heavy tower shield in his left hand and his hammer staff in his right. The creature was close to level 200, not much of a threat compared to the tier 3 class holders he had faced before. Even the weakest knight commander he had defeated would have been stronger. His goal was to grow stronger, and relying solely on his runic equipment could sometimes put his life at risk. While his mana pool was vast, it wasn't infinite. He could already envision himself faltering in a prolonged battle. The more powerful his creations became, the more mana they consumed, and he needed to prepare for the possibility of encountering an enemy capable of nullifying his magical tools or draining his energy. While dispelling anti-magical dust was feasible, he needed to plan for opponents employing entirely different methods. His level wasn't that high, so battling these types of enemies would allow him to level up his previously ignored battle skills more easily. Thus he raised his shield and got ready as the bird monster was getting ready to pounce. The eagle lunged first, its massive wings whipping up a gale force wind that sent debris tumbling from the temple walls. Roland crouched, bracing himself as the gust slammed into him. He put all his weight behind his shield, taking the charge head-on. The black mithril barrier absorbed the impact of the monster's talons. A normal person would have had their arm shattered, but thanks to his enhanced body, strengthened by the Overlord class, Roland managed to hold firm under the immense pressure. I barely managed to defend myself. He hadn't activated any buffing spells or Overlord's might to enhance his power. This was his base physical strength, bolstered only by his tier 3 multiplier, which allowed him to stand toe-to-toe with the boss monster. Still, he felt the strain in his wrist and knew that staying rooted in place would be a mistake. The creature's talons slashed downward, crackling with lightning-like energy. The surge rippled through Roland's frame but was mostly absorbed by his armor. However, he noticed a glaring weakness: the red mithril, while excellent at mitigating fire-based attacks, was far less effective against wind and lightning. A sharp pain shot through his body, but he gritted his teeth and pressed forward. Seizing the moment as the creature overcommitted to its attack on his shield, Roland swung his hammer at its exposed side, the weapon increasing in speed as he activated one of his attacking skills. The hammer crackled with raw energy as it connected with the Storm Eagle's flank, the force of the blow sending a shockwave through the air. The creature let out a deafening screech, the impact throwing it off balance. Roland capitalized on the opening, stepping forward and striking again, this time aiming for the creature's wing joint. Congratulations, Mighty Bash has reached level 6. Congratulations, Mighty Bash has reached level 7. Instantly, his system chimed with a notification: one of his previously unused skills had leveled up. It was a tier 2 skill he had acquired long ago but rarely trained. The system had boosted it by 2 levels almost immediately, rewarding him for engaging in true combat with a monster near his level, which seemed to exceed training on immobilized undead. He made a mental note of this before turning his attention back to the airborne beast. The eagle recoiled, one wing folding awkwardly as it struggled to stay aloft. Green wind energy erupted from its body, forming miniature tornadoes that spiraled across the chamber. The swirling winds threatened to throw Roland off his feet, but he crouched low, driving his shield into the stone floor to anchor himself against the relentless gale. It changed tactics. Roland observed the monster carefully. After taking a few solid hits, it had disengaged, flying higher to gain distance and a better vantage point. The strategy was simple yet effective, securing the high ground to regain control of the battle. Normally, he would use his own range spells to counter this issue, but this was a test of his physical skills, so he needed to adapt in other ways. Roland took a moment to analyze the Storm Eagle's movement, observing how it used its massive wings to channel mana into its surroundings, creating those chaotic tornadoes. The air was thick with raw elemental power, and the gusts made it hard to focus. He could feel his body straining under the constant pressure, but he wasn't about to back down now. Something is coming. Though he wasn't actively using his runic skills, Roland relied on his mana sense to monitor the situation. A massive amount of energy was converging in the monster's abdomen, gathering for something big. The energy surged upward through the creature's neck as it reared its head back, clearly preparing to unleash an attack. He assessed his options: use his shield to block the impending strike, attempt to dodge, or go on the offensive and attack before the monster could complete its move. The decision was made in an instant. His hammer clicked as a sharp spear-like head emerged from the top, turning it into something that resembled a poleaxe. He gripped the transformed weapon tightly, his muscles coiling as he prepared to throw. The Storm Eagle's throat glowed with green and yellow light as the gathered mana surged upward, a telltale sign of an imminent breath attack. Roland had seen enough dragons and elemental monsters to know how devastating such an attack could be, especially in an enclosed space like this. With a deep exhale, he hurled the poleaxe with all his might, activating another stamina-based skill. The weapon streaked through the air like a lightning bolt, slicing through the chaotic winds as if it were nothing. The Storm Eagle didn't even have time to react. The poleaxe embedded itself deeply into its stomach, just as the creature opened its beak to release its attack. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. The sudden disruption to the mana flow caused the gathered energy to explode prematurely. A deafening boom shook the entire temple as a violent surge of wind and lightning energy erupted from the Storm Eagle's body. The blast obliterated parts of the temple's interior and sent cracks racing across the dungeon ceiling above. Chunks of stone tumbled down, some narrowly missing Roland as he scrambled for cover. Agni, positioned at the chamber's entrance, howled in alarm but held his ground. His fiery aura flared brighter, deflecting smaller debris. Roland crouched behind his shield and took cover as the monster's energies ran wild. When the dust settled, the once majestic Storm Eagle lay crumpled on the ground, its body twitching as residual sparks of lightning danced across its feathers. The creature let out a weak, rasping cry before its form disintegrated into motes of green and yellow light, leaving behind a cluster of high-quality wind crystals along with an orb that was its core. Congratulations, mighty throw has reached level 4. High Elemental Storm Eagle has been slain. Another of his skills leveled up, one he had acquired alongside the previous but had rarely used. With the mini-boss defeated, Roland strode over to retrieve his weapon from where it lay on the ground. The battle had gone exceptionally well, but the victory was owed entirely to his calculated tactics and the versatility of his multi-purpose weapon, which misled his opponent into thinking he lacked ranged capabilities. Still, he couldn't ignore the risks he had taken. A misjudgment of even a millisecond or a millimeter could have resulted in a missed strike, leaving him without a weapon to continue the fight. Even though he had emerged victorious, fatigue began to set in. Using only his physical stats was something he wasn't accustomed to, but if he wanted to address his weaknesses, it was an aspect of himself that needed strengthening. With the battle over, Roland reactivated his runic spells, summoning his hammer back into the palm of his hand. His gaze then shifted to the spoils left behind by the monster. More wind crystals like those from the wind elementals, some strange feathers, and a core. At first glance, the monster appeared to be a genuine bird, but upon closer inspection, it was more of a magical golem, created from condensed mana and elemental energy. Once its core had been damaged by his hammer, the stored mana within had gone berserk, leading to its destruction. He knew that understanding an enemy's weaknesses was half the battle. Targeting the core directly had been a calculated gamble, and it had paid off. The dropped feathers caught his attention. They pulsed faintly with wind mana, their surface shimmering in shades of green and silver. Despite their delicate, almost ethereal appearance, the feathers were surprisingly resilient. After picking one up, Roland examined it closely. The feathers seemed to both absorb and emit wind mana along with electricity, similar to the wind crystals he had collected earlier, but in a far more concentrated form. He turned it over in his hand and considered its potential uses. Though his runesmithing skills were advanced, he wasn't certain he could create anything practical from these materials. This particular drop might serve Rastix better or fetch a good price at the auction house. While his knowledge was extensive, he didn't know every alchemical recipe or the myriad uses of monster parts scattered across this world. Hey, what are you doing? Spit that out. Agni froze mid-chew, his fiery maw clamped around the high-quality wind core. His eyes darted guiltily to Roland, ears flattening as if he knew he'd been caught. The monster's core still glowed faintly, pulsating with energy, though now slightly covered in Agni's fiery drool. Agni, we talked about this. You can't just go chomping on everything we find. Awu. He marched toward his flaming companion, who had the decency to whimper softly, letting the core drop to the ground with a muted thud. The wolf's flames flickered lower, a clear sign of his remorse, but Roland wasn't letting this slide. He crouched to inspect the core, carefully wiping it off with a cloth from his satchel. You're lucky this didn't crack, but just for this, you're not getting any mana crystals for a whole week. Agni let out a pitiful whimper, his fiery tail drooping low as he pawed at the ground in protest. Roland, however, remained firm, his expression unyielding as he tucked the cleaned core into his storage. No, Agni. Don't give me those puppy eyes. You need to learn to control yourself. I think all that worship from the Solarian believers is getting to your head. Now that I think about it, you do look heavier. Have they been feeding you extra treats? Agni turned his head to the side, the very picture of a guilty child caught with their hand in the cookie jar. Roland sighed, knowing full well the worshippers were likely spoiling the holy beast with offerings. Narrowing his eyes, he watched as the wolf let out an exaggerated sigh of his own and collapsed onto the stone floor in an overly dramatic heap. His fiery mane dimmed to a faint glow, the very image of resignation. Roland's lips turned into a smirk at his partner's antics, though he kept his stern expression intact. Maybe I should start rationing your snacks too. Roland chuckled aloud, earning another whine from Agni, whose ears flattened even further. You'll survive. Now get up. We still have 3 more temples to get through. After shaking his head, Roland turned his attention back to the now cleared temple chamber. There were no hidden passages, only the elemental block remained, ready for him to pick up. It was the same shape as the one he had retrieved from the flame temple, but the magic it radiated belonged to the wind element. He slipped the block into his storage, the artifact instantly dimming as it entered the spatial space. As expected, the temple began to rumble, the dungeon's mechanisms resetting in preparation for future challengers. The magical winds that had once howled within the temple quieted, leaving behind an eerie stillness. Roland and Agni continued their quest, venturing further towards the other elemental temples in search of the remaining blocks. After securing the wind elemental block from the green temple, they proceeded to the water temple, where new challenges awaited them. The water temple stood serene yet ominous, its architecture mirroring the fluid and ever-changing nature of its element. Roland cautiously approached the entrance, scanning for traps and hidden runes through the lenses of his visor. As he had expected, the gate required the wind elemental block to proceed. With precision, he slotted it into place. The gates shimmered briefly before parting, granting them entry. Inside, the temple's atmosphere shifted immediately. The air grew damp and cool, and the sound of trickling water echoed softly through the narrow, winding corridors. Roland and Agni soon encountered elemental monsters once again. Skeletal forms, infused with shimmering water energy, rose to bar their path. Upon being defeated, these creatures dropped resources similar to those found in other temples. This time, Roland was rewarded with tide metal, a fluid-like metal that gleamed with a brilliant blue under light. Its properties resembled mercury, making it more challenging to collect than the solid materials he had encountered before. The serpentine water elementals yielded high-quality water element crystals upon defeat. As they pressed on, Roland and Agni discovered several hidden treasure rooms, their persistence rewarded with rare finds, including a Tier 3 trident made with the previously mentioned tide metal. While the enemies were no stronger than those encountered in the flame and wind temples, navigating the water temple presented far greater challenges. Many of the tunnels were submerged, and Roland and Agni had to contend with multiple flooded chambers dominated by colossal water serpents. Agni's flames, typically an asset, proved to be more of a hindrance here. The intense heat generated large amounts of steam, making the air thick and difficult to breathe. Worse still, the flames were largely ineffective against the water elementals. Only the skeletons seemed vulnerable, their defeat aided by the divine energies imbued in Agni's fire. The frustration led Roland to briefly wonder if it might be wiser to leave Agni outside entirely. However, just as Roland was striving to overcome his own weaknesses, he felt it was important for Agni to face his as well. The wolf needed to learn how to handle his vulnerability to the water element and contend with enemies that wielded its power. Roland knew he wouldn't always be there to protect him. Resolute in this belief, they pressed on with their adventure, eventually climbing their way to the lair of the temple's next mini-boss, a massive, menacing toothy fish. The upper portion of the temple was saturated with water elemental mana particles, so thick that they formed an ethereal environment where the creature swam with ease. The sight was both fascinating and humbling, serving as a stark reminder to Roland that he was still relatively inexperienced as an adventurer. He could count the number of dungeons he had explored on one hand, and each seemed to present a unique and unexpected challenge. Defeating the creature proved to be a grueling task. Its erratic movement patterns were difficult to predict, and the relentless waves of water it summoned only added to the chaos. Roland found himself being pushed, not quite to his limit, but he was getting there. Perhaps I should do this some other time. Roland grumbled under his breath as yet another wave of water crashed into him, drenching his armor completely. Without the use of his mana to form a thin protective barrier, much of the water seeped inside, leaving him with an uncomfortable, damp sensation. It was a new challenge, fighting without his magic, with the relentless water pushing against him, making his attacks weaker and harder to land. "Come here, you damn fish!" With a groan, he took off running. This stupid fish wouldn't get the best of him even without his magic, he would persevere. "Awoo! I'm fine, Agni, just give me a minute," Roland replied as Agni's nose poked him. He was panting and leaning up against one of the remaining walls. His body was drenched with water, his armor clinking with every heaving breath. Thanks to the carp's relentless water attacks, the once pristine temple floor now resembled a shallow pond. Agni, dripping as well, shook his body with an exaggerated swish, spraying droplets everywhere, mainly onto Roland. "Agni!" Roland shouted, holding up a hand to shield himself. "Do you have to do that?" Agni cocked his head innocently, his ears twitching. "Awoo!" Roland sighed. "I swear, you're doing this on purpose. I'll remember this next time you're hungry." Agni responded by plopping onto the wet ground with an audible splat, his fiery fur sizzling as it met the damp floor. The wolf gave Roland a half-lidded look, his tail lazily swishing through the puddles. Roland groaned as he trudged through the waterlogged chamber, gathering the spoils left by the high-spirit carp. Among them was a glossy blue orb that pulsed faintly with water mana and a pile of shimmering scale-like fragments. He eyed the orb warily. "Let me guess, you want to eat this one too?" Agni perked up instantly, his tail wagging. Roland waved a finger. "How about no?" Agni gave an indignant huff, clearly displeased at being refused the chance to eat the mana-rich crystals dropped by the creatures. Roland, on the other hand, wasn't sure what everything was useful for, so it seemed wiser to assess their worth after consulting Rastix and others like Brovia. For all he knew, some of these items could be components for advanced weaponry or golemic creations. "Stop being a drama queen, Agni. Let's go, we still have 2 more temples to conquer, and then there's that last door." With the loot secured, Roland and Agni pressed on toward the Earth Temple. Along with the one aligned to the darkness element, it was one of the 2 remaining. Once he secured all 5 elemental blocks, Roland assumed he would be able to unlock the closed door. He had previously let his golems analyze the door, revealing its considerable magical defenses. While it was possible to attempt forcing his way through, he was certain that such an approach would trigger traps. It seemed far better to assemble more defensive turrets and set up a generator before attempting to test the door's defenses. Soon the 2 made their way towards the Earth Temple. Their progress was steady as it only took them 4 hours to clear the previous 2 temples. Roland paused before the sealed door, noting the faint indentation that matched the water elemental block in his possession. The magic symbols around the entrance shimmered briefly before the heavy stone doors groaned open, revealing a dimly lit passageway that stretched into the depths of rocky temple. Stone sentinels that resemble rock golems but were in truth earth elementals blocked their path. This temple was similar to the other 3 he already cleared, so going through it proved simple. The monsters here were on the same levels as the other elementals, and he also noticed undead with rocky armors lumbering about. Once defeated, he was given earth elemental crystals from the rocky monsters and terranite, a solid, earthy ore, quite dense and resistant. These things are hard. He had reached the final chamber where the next elemental block awaited. His hand trembled slightly, a testament to the strain he had endured. He had been relentlessly training his physical skills, smashing monsters with his hammer. Though the weapon was effective at breaking through their defenses, the resulting vibrations had taken a toll on his hands. He was also out of breath, unlike casting runic spells, which didn't rely on stamina, his regular battle skills demanded it. Stamina, hey! As he pondered this issue, his thoughts veered in another direction. His primary goal was to strengthen himself for moments when mana wasn't an option, or when he lacked access to runes. Stamina, like mana, was another vital resource in this world, influenced by general stats and bolstered by passive skills or traits. There were likely methods to increase his stamina, but a question lingered in his mind: was it possible to use stamina in conjunction with runes? With his mind churning, Roland stepped into the area, this time with Agni by his side. While Agni's flames hadn't been particularly effective against the other monsters, he could provide valuable ranged support against this next foe, a formidable matchup for a physical fighter. As expected, it was a golem-type creature, one crafted from pitch-dark obsidian. Hide Obsidian Golem L199. The golem was far larger than the previous monsters Roland had faced and also much slower. It resembled a colossal stone giant, towering close to 7 meters high. Its body was a fusion of jagged rocks, with glowing veins of energy coursing through its chest and limbs. Its eyes burned with a fiery amber light, and each of its thunderous steps sent tremors rippling across the temple floor. Through his visor, Roland carefully studied the colossus, analyzing its movements and attack patterns. The creature wielded no weapon, but its massive arms were lined with sharp, spiked protrusions, each as long as a dagger. One solid hit from those arms would undoubtedly send him flying against the temple walls, or worse, tumbling off the structure entirely. Agni, keep your distance, and focus on its joints, try to slow it down. Roland issued a command to his wolf partner. Agni's task was simple, to pester the golem with light fire attacks while Roland moved in for the offensive. It was a straightforward tactic that worked well against mindless monsters like this one. However, an issue quickly arose. As expected, the golem reacted to Agni's flames, immediately shifting its focus to the wolf. Agni, with his superior agility, had no trouble keeping out of the creature's reach. This distraction gave Roland the perfect opening to strike. He aimed for the monster's joints, swinging his hammer with precision and channeling one of his skills to enhance the impact. The hammer collided with the golem's obsidian surface, but instead of bringing the massive creature down to its knees, the strike only managed to chip the stone slightly. "He's tougher than I thought," Roland muttered under his breath. Before he could formulate his next move, the golem turned toward him, its glowing amber eyes locking onto him once more. Reacting quickly, Roland leaped back, narrowly avoiding a devastating counterattack. As before, Agni immediately resumed pestering the creature, drawing its attention away and giving Roland another opening. These types of monsters had been studied extensively by adventurers over the years. Their weaknesses were well documented, targeting the leg joints was key. Once a leg was damaged enough, the monster would collapse under its own weight, exposing its core. Striking the core would deliver the finishing blow. In theory, it sounded straightforward. In practice, it was anything but. The core's location was a challenge as it was encased deep within the monster's dense obsidian body. Reaching it required delivering a devastatingly precise blow, all while avoiding the creature's powerful counterattacks. Though Roland knew the core's exact location, his physical skills, which had yet to reach Tier 3, were insufficient to deal the necessary damage. Perhaps runes are the only option here, he thought to himself, considering a shift back to mana-based attacks. Then, a sudden thought crossed his mind. Wait, there's that type of energy. What if I simulated it instead? A bright idea sparked to life. It was a concept he had pondered before, something he had come across in the literature during his time at the Institute. If he could replicate this energy, it might offer the solution he needed. In his time, Roland had successfully replicated obscure energies, like those used by priests and necromancers. The energy he had in mind now, however, didn't originate from magic, but that wouldn't stop him. In theory, it shouldn't be that difficult to recreate. This new type of energy was different from what he was accustomed to, and he had never seen much reason to replicate it before, as magic had always been the superior option. However, if he wanted to focus on stamina-based attacks, this would be the natural upgrade. The energy he was thinking of was spirit, and its direct upgrade, aura. Aura was used by the more prestigious fighter classes and required vast amounts of stamina to wield, alongside its own unique resource. Well, no reason not to try it. He muttered the incantation before holding out his hammer. The weapon shimmered, and the runes etched onto it began to shift as he activated his runesmithing skill. Even without striking the hammer against the weapon, Roland could alter its structure, it just required a copious amount of mana. With his level of expertise, it didn't take long, and soon he had adjusted the settings to align with his goal. As before, Agni kept the golem distracted, darting around and evading the monster's slow, telegraphed attacks. Roland seized this opportunity to strike. Dropping his shield, he gripped his hammer with both hands and sprinted forward. His weapon pulsed with crimson energy, and as he swung it down onto the golem's back, the resulting impact generated a massive explosion. The shockwave reverberated through the upper temple, sending tremors that rattled the very stone beneath his feet. The force of the strike cracked the obsidian plating along the golem's back, sending shards of dark stone flying in all directions. The golem let out an inhuman roar as it staggered forward, its movements stopping almost instantly. After the dust had settled, it became clear that Roland had created a massive gaping hole in the golem, blasting all the way through. The obsidian giant wavered for a moment, its massive form swaying precariously. Roland's hammer clattered to the ground as he dropped to his knees, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. His breaths came in ragged gasps, his stamina almost fully drained just from one attack. The golem let out a final, echoing groan, its fiery amber eyes dimming. Its enormous frame began to crumble, chunks of obsidian falling away to reveal a cracked core. The core pulsed once, twice, and then shattered in a burst of light. The temple fell silent, the tremors that were echoing during the fight now gone. "Awoo. I'm fine, just tired." Agni quickly ran toward Roland, who had dropped to one knee after performing his attack. He had attempted to simulate an aura attack using rune magic and had been partially successful, but not entirely. The technique had drained him of almost all his stamina and required some mana to activate. After all, it was still a rune, and mana was a necessary component. It's not quite a failure. I still managed to reduce the mana requirements by a large amount. I could potentially use this in a mana-thin environment, I'd just need a sliver of mana to activate it. The main limiting factor was aura itself, which was a resource of its own. While Roland could emulate the energy using his mana, he didn't have true aura within his body. Fighters cultivated aura through years of training or unlocked it through special means, making it an exclusive and difficult power to wield. There was a structured approach to acquiring this sought-after resource, which primarily came down to training, perseverance, and a bit of luck. Arthur had managed to unlock it, but he was a fencer, not a runesmith. Roland, on the other hand, was a runesmith, and while he lacked true aura, he could still emulate some of its power. Judging by the damage he had caused, this rune was undeniably powerful. However, its major drawback was that it consumed most of his stamina, leaving him vulnerable after use. I suppose it could be useful under certain circumstances. He stood up, nodding to himself. While this technique wasn't ideal for direct combat, it was another tool in his arsenal. Spell nullifying techniques typically focused on disrupting spells during their formation, rather than the mana that mages had already gathered. Even if his standard runic spells were countered, he could still likely activate this aura rune. Some additional testing would be necessary, but this experiment appeared to be a success. Good, let's get the block and move on to the next one. After gathering up the obsidian parts from the defeated golem and its core, the two left the dormant earth temple. 4 of the 5 elemental blocks were now in his possession, and only the darkness temple remained. Though the trials weren't that difficult, he still exhausted himself by limiting his use of mana. The path to the darkness temple was cloaked in an unsettling stillness. Dead trees with skeletal branches stretched out like gnarled fingers, casting eerie shadows over the desolate trail. A chill wind swept through the barren landscape, carrying an unnatural silence that seemed to consume all sound. Even Agni, normally brimming with playful energy, stayed close to Roland. His fiery mane, usually a vibrant blaze, dimmed as they approached the temple's imposing silhouette. The temple bore an aesthetic reminiscent of Aztec architecture, yet it stood apart with its own distinct features. Its structure was composed of pure black stone, jagged and forbidding, absorbing all light in the area and making it difficult to see clearly. Tendrils of shadow coiled and writhed around its base as if alive, exuding an aura of malevolence that even made Roland feel uneasy. "Stay close, Agni. I have a bad feeling about this one." The earth block activated the entrance, and as they stepped inside, the temperature dropped further. The air was heavy, suffused with a dark, oppressive energy. Unlike the previous temples, which had been alive with elemental activity, this one felt empty. Or rather, it felt as though something was watching, waiting. The first chamber was vast and cloaked in near-total darkness. Roland activated his runic visor, revealing faint outlines of jagged pillars and broken statues. As he moved cautiously forward, shadowy figures began to materialize around him. They were formless at first, but as they approached, they took on humanoid shapes, their bodies composed entirely of swirling darkness. Pale, glowing eyes locked onto Roland and Agni. Infernal Shade Entity 201. Roland swung his hammer as the first creature lunged at him, the weapon passing harmlessly through its body. The shade reformed instantly, hissing as it struck back with an unnervingly sharp claw that almost raked across Roland's armor. Though the blow didn't connect, the chill it left behind somehow started seeping away his strength. Physical attacks don't work. These are shade creatures. Agni let out a low growl and leaped forward, his flames roaring to life as he sank his teeth into one of the shades. The creature recoiled, part of its shadowy form consumed by the searing divine fire. Roland observed the effect and quickly realized that his training session would have to end sooner than planned. These creatures were immune to conventional attacks, magic was the only means of survival against them. Well, I had a good run, but I'm also working on a schedule. Suddenly, as if unleashed by an unseen force, a massive surge of light erupted from Roland's body. The runes shifted, transforming his crimson armor into a radiant, luminescent display of gold. The glowing energy pulsed, and Roland could feel his mana flowing through the runes, filling him with power. The golden light illuminated the entire area, revealing several more shade creatures hiding in the shadows. Let's speed this up, Agni. I'm starting to get hungry. After this one, let's take a break and have a bite. Woof. Yeah, sure. If you do well, I'll give you some crystals to munch on. Woof. Agni, clearly reinvigorated, perked up with his tail wagging and flames erupting around his body. The temple walls and the shades fought to absorb the overwhelming light, but there was simply too much of it for them to handle. The dark entities recoiled in the face of his newfound aura. The light pulsed brighter and brighter, filling the entire room with a radiance so powerful it almost erased the monsters instantly. With his mana amplifying his runes, the fight turned into a cakewalk. The monsters didn't stand a chance, and even when they drew near, they were repelled by a mana shield of their opposite element, light. That about does it for this one. Within moments, all the shades had been destroyed, and the light surrounding Roland began to fade. Umbrium, this time, hey! His reward was a shadowy crystal that radiated the essence of darkness, another addition to his growing elemental collection. With that taken care of, all that remained was to retrieve the final elemental block and move on to whatever lay hidden behind the massive door. A screech erupted from the top of the dark temple. A massive monster, composed of writhing dark energy, convulsed in agony at the sight of light. Standing before it was Roland, his hammer glistening with holy radiance. Beside him, Agni stood proudly, snorting in amusement at the thrashing creature. It would be hard for a regular adventurer to face this thing, Roland remarked, his gaze fixed on the monstrous shade. This abomination had 3 sets of shadowy talons for arms and a head that was nothing but jagged teeth. Now, he stood at the top of the temple, having scaled it with impressive speed as his runic magic aided him in dispatching the shadowy monsters lurking within. The dark magic saturating this place was highly vulnerable to light and holy radiance, making it nearly impossible for anyone to claim this area without the aid of a high-level priest. However, for Roland, who could emulate various elemental energies, it posed no such challenge. Roland adjusted his grip on the hammer, his armor radiating an aura of golden serenity that contrasted starkly with the chaos surrounding him. The monstrous shade reared back, its formless body recoiling in response to the intense light emanating from his runes. Its unearthly screech echoed across the darkened temple, shaking loose chunks of obsidian from the temple walls. Agni, flank it and keep your range, even if it's weakened it still is dangerous. Agni obeyed instantly, darting around the creature in a fiery blur. The wolf's flames intensified as he opened his muzzle to produce a breathing attack consisting of holy flames. The holy flames seared through the darkness, forcing the monstrous shade back as it let out another deafening screech. Roland seized the moment, surging forward with his hammer glowing brighter than ever. Each step echoed like a thunderclap across the temple's summit, as his body was surrounded by radiant energy and surged through it. The monstrous shade, now cornered, unleashed a volley of dark projectiles. They streaked toward Roland with terrifying speed, leaving trails of shadow in their wake. Yet, he didn't falter. Instead, he continued charging forward, his radiant mana mantle repelling the shadowy attacks with ease. The monster's projectiles were powerless against the barrier of light. Roland was done holding back his mana, and the overwhelming difference in power had become evident. Earlier, he had struggled against the fish-like mini-boss and even the Wind Eagle, but this, the strongest of them all, couldn't lay a scratch on him once he fully activated his runes. The sheer power he could wield was staggering. The shade's fate was sealed when Roland's hammer met its shadowy form. The impact created a massive explosion of light, so blinding and powerful that it seemed as though a Solarian paladin himself had struck the final blow. High Shade Terror has been slain. When the blinding radiance subsided, Roland stood amidst the crumbling remains of the monstrous shade. Its form disintegrated into wisps of shadow, leaving behind a single artifact, a jagged obsidian shard that pulsed faintly with dark energy. Roland picked it up, feeling a peculiar weight in the shard, as though it held a fragment of the shade's essence. Dark Core Fragment. He muttered, reading the name that appeared on his system window after using his high analyze skill. This might be useful, or dangerous, Should I try some curse magic or not? He secured the fragment within his spatial rune, his mind wandering to the possibilities of expanding his mastery of magic. Necrotic energies were already within his repertoire, so delving into occult magic and dark rituals was a plausible path. However, such practices were considered even more malevolent than necromancy. They often demanded live human sacrifices or could be substituted by leaders of blood and other vile acts. Worse still, these rituals sometimes carried a psychological toll, warping the caster's mind and making them increasingly cruel. Still, perhaps I could implement some dark debuffing runes. Those should be safe, at least to some extent. While he could use buffing runes to make himself stronger, he would gain even more of an advantage if he could reduce his enemies' stats. Even if they would just decrease BYT 5 or 10%, that could be enough to achieve victory. Even the most trained fighter would probably have a hard time adjusting to a decrease in their agility, giving him a small window to retaliate. Let's see. Name: Roland Arden L199. Classes: T3 Runesmith Overlord L24 Primary, T2 Runesmith Lord L50 Tertiary, T2 Runic Engineer L50 Secondary, T1 Mage L25X, T1 Runic Monoscribe L25X, T1 Runic Blacksmith L25X. HP: 47855/47855. MP: 72147/91771. SP: 52114/65804. Strength: 320. Agility: 262. Dexterity: 354. Vitality: 333. Endurance: 367. Intelligence: 418. Willpower: 404. Charisma: 21. Luck: 12. It seems that I'll need more than 200 stat points to upgrade those traits. Roland looked at his status screen and noticed that he had 2 stats over 400. Previously, when he reached 200 in each stat, he was given a trait like swiftness or dexterous. Now on the other hand, he wasn't given anything further. These traits had numbers to them, so he probably needed to gain more to get them, probably either 500 points or more. No new skills for now, perhaps when I get to 200 I'll get something good. Well then. Let's get that elemental block out of here and see what's behind that door. Agni. Woof. After securing the ominous dark elemental block, the pair began their descent from the temple. The oppressive darkness that had permeated the structure dissipated almost instantly once Roland stored the artifact in his inventory. Initially, he considered using his glider to fly toward the final area of this level, but an issue presented itself, a large wolf issue. Agni's considerable weight would make holding him steady during flight a real challenge. Maybe I should design some sort of harness to carry him around. Agni tilted his head to the side, his expression curious, as Roland's mind conjured a mental image of a stranded orca being carried by a helicopter or hoisted by a crane. The absurdity of the thought made him chuckle, though he was certain his wolven companion wouldn't appreciate such an undignified ride. Ultimately, Roland decided against flying and chose instead to retrace their steps through the area they had already explored. With the boss defeated, the temple's traps had been deactivated, making the journey back uneventful and far less dangerous. What remained was to approach the large gate-like door and discover what lay beyond it. Soon, the pair arrived at the area, which was eerily devoid of any monsters. Before them stood the double doors, adorned with skull motifs, designs they had seen earlier in the surroundings. However, these doors were different. They were encased in obsidian, a dark, smooth, and incredibly durable stone. The runes etched into the doors pulsed with a faint red glow, enhancing the eerie atmosphere. All right, Agni, this is it. They were now before the runic doors and he decided to take out the 5 blocks from his spatial space. Once they were out in the open, they regained their properties and started glowing from the excess mana radiation. There was a slight difference now as each of the 5 elemental blocks began to flicker as if they were resonating with this door. This seems easy enough. At the base, there were slots into which he could insert the blocks. He had previously scanned the area using his golems and once more with his own armor and abilities. At first glance, it appeared to be a simple puzzle, just insert the blocks in the same order he had cleared the temples, and that would solve it. However, there was more to this than met the eye. I suppose any regular person would try to place them in the same order, or reverse it, and then they'd probably die. For someone with extensive knowledge of mana patterns, this puzzle wasn't overly difficult. The blocks, positioned before the gate, emitted a faint hum. To the untrained eye, it might not seem like much, but to someone with mana-sensing skills, there was more beneath the surface. One of the blocks, the one representing darkness, was resonating first. He also sensed that beneath him lay a large runic formation. Though it was hidden and buried under the rocky ground, he could faintly feel the magical energy pulsing beneath his feet. He deduced that placing the blocks incorrectly would likely trigger the trap, incinerating anyone nearby. To ensure safety, he instructed Agni to retreat. He followed suit, distancing himself from the immediate area. Using his mage hand spell, he carefully inserted the blocks in the correct order, beginning with the one representing darkness. Once it was inserted, the runes started shifting, changing pattern and color to represent the color of the elemental block, which was black. Interesting, I suppose it starts with darkness, and then will fire represent the sun. The next element that needed to be placed represented fire. He used his spell once again, carefully guiding the block into its slot. As it clicked into place, a fiery red light surged through the runes, illuminating the obsidian door with intricate patterns that danced like flames. The resonance continued to build, each element layering over the last, creating a cascading interplay of energy. Fire next, is the earth element after that? Perhaps it represents the planet we live on. Roland muttered, his gaze shifting to the brownish block. After confirming the resonating mana, he inserted it into another slot. The fiery glow of the previous block dimmed, transforming into an earthy brown. Next, he added the block representing water, its azure hue perhaps symbolizing the origin of all life. Finally, he placed the wind block. As it slid into its slot, the azure glow of the water block shifted to a vibrant green. It was done. With all 5 blocks in place, the door began to react. The obsidian doors trembled as the runes etched upon them flared to life, pulsating in sync with the elemental blocks. The whole area resonated, building in intensity as the mana energy cascaded through the intricate web of runes. The blocks emitted an otherworldly glow, the colors of the elements blending into a swirling aurora that danced along the stone surface. Oh! They are burning out. As the door began to open, Roland's attention shifted to the slots where he had placed the blocks. They were sizzling, shrinking as though the door was siphoning their energy to power its mechanism. It was clear this dungeon wasn't designed for convenience. Gaining access to this room would likely require adventurers to repeatedly clear all 5 temples to obtain new blocks for each attempt. I can already see the adventurers fighting over these blocks. Adventurers often formed parties, but that didn't mean they truly cooperated with others. Roland could easily imagine groups clearing out temples and hoarding the blocks for themselves. They might even resort to blackmail, demanding payment from those who wanted to progress further. While these blocks couldn't be used outside the dungeon, they could be concealed in spatial artifacts, hidden away, or even carried to higher levels. Whether the blocks would eventually regenerate remained unclear. Given the potential for conflict, Roland concluded it would be better if his people monopolized this area. Controlling access would reduce friction among platinum adventurers and prevent unnecessary disputes. Doesn't hurt that the resources are worth it. The blocks had vanished and the door started to creak open. He noticed that the mana that had been within the area was starting to seep away toward the 5 towers he had cleared. He concluded that soon they would start to regenerate themselves to produce more monsters and that perhaps he could hasten the process by quickly clearing them with the power of turrets and support golems. Here we go, stay close to me Agni, we don't know what's through there. Agni barked softly, his fiery mane flaring in anticipation. With a deafening groan, the massive doors began to part. Streams of dark mist seeped from the widening gap, and an oppressive wave of energy washed over them. The air grew colder, denser, and every instinct in Roland's body screamed caution. Whatever lay beyond was no ordinary challenge. It's hard to see, better to be safe than sorry later. As the doors fully opened, they revealed a vast, cavernous space shrouded in dim light. From his current position, it was difficult to make out any details due to the thick fog that obscured most of the view. Fortunately, Roland had methods of detecting potential dangers. One of his floating golems arrived, and he sent it inside first to scout for traps and signs of lurking monsters. It was possible that whatever lay within the cavern could exceed his capabilities, and once inside, leaving might become difficult. He had already examined the exterior of the structure and found no alternative entry points, besides perhaps drilling through the hardened rock. If monsters of many levels above him lurked there, then he would have to postpone his journey further, his life was still more important and he had already secured resources to help him progress further. The golem's magical sensors flared to life as it glided into the cavern, its glowing eye scanning the space and transmitting a real-time feed to Roland's visor. Through the golem's perspective, he began to uncover the concealed grandeur of the chamber. The first thing Roland noticed was the sheer size of the room. It was enormous, easily the size of several football fields. The ceiling stretched so high that it disappeared into the shadows. The floor was a flawless obsidian, polished to a mirror-like shine that reflected the glow of the golem's runes. This obsidian ore, I wonder if we could mine it too. This dungeon was quite sturdy, and if he was going to create a safe region here with a teleportation gate, then he wanted to farm it for all it was worth. The dungeon would regenerate itself eventually, and these walls seemed to be able to easily resist Tier 3 might. However, there were other things that required his attention as the golem continued to flow forward without being attacked by anything. Rows upon rows of human-shaped statues lined the walls, their numbers easily in the hundreds. Each statue was unique, depicting warriors, mages, and creatures frozen in lifelike poses. Their craftsmanship was unparalleled, every detail, from the folds in their garments to the expressions on their faces, had been rendered with eerie precision. They were unervingly lifelike, as if at any moment, they might step forward and attack. Soon Roland adjusted the golem's angle to focus on the statue's eyes, which seemed to follow the golem's movements. It was clear that these weren't just normal rock carvings but probably monsters or golems waiting for unsuspecting adventurers to step forward. Creepy, and the numbers are problematic. He muttered and was sure that if he stepped forward, he would be ambushed. As the golem ventured further, Roland's unease grew. At the far end of the chamber stood a colossal throne, carved directly from the black stone. Sitting upon it was a massive statue, far larger than the others. It was humanoid, but its proportions were unnatural, towering, broad-shouldered, and impossibly imposing. This figure wore a crown adorned with jagged spikes, and its hands rested on the armrests of the throne, clawed fingers curled as though ready to grip an unseen weapon. Unlike the other statues, this one radiated power, marking it as likely the main foe he would face if he stepped forward. The doors that had previously opened were starting to creak shut again, they were closing, and he had to make a decision. He could either step forward and face the danger inside or take a more strategic approach by leaving his golemic creation inside to perform more scans. There doesn't seem to be any other pathway leading out of that chamber. He glanced at the readings his golem was transmitting, then looked back at Agni. His wolf perked up its ears, as if trying to signal that he wanted to go inside. For a moment, he deliberated. Eventually, Roland nodded and stepped forward. It was time to uncover the other secrets hidden within this strange dungeon. As Roland stepped through the colossal doors, Agni padded close behind, his fiery aura illuminating their path. The obsidian floor echoed softly under their boots and paws, amplifying the eerie silence that filled the massive chamber. The oppressive energy within seemed to press against Roland's chest, a silent warning that their presence was unwelcome. "Stop, Agni! Worf!" The door creaked shut behind them, and he ordered his wolf to halt. The area before them was truly vast, with hundreds of statues lining the sides, their stony gazes fixed on the newcomers. However, the statues were not fully animated, at least, not yet. He had analyzed how this area worked, thanks to the runes permeating the massive chamber. Any normal adventurer would have probably made a mistake by now and already been attacked. His visor flashed as he scanned the area, revealing the hidden runic pathways. The intricate web of runes stretched across the floor, walls, and ceiling. Touching even one would likely trigger a cascading reaction, causing the small army of obsidian statues to attack. Fortunately, he had sent his floating golem ahead. The construct hovered through the chamber without disturbing the traps, confirming his suspicions. Near the entrance was a small, safe zone free of runes or traps. The guardians would stay dormant if they remained there and refrained from attacking. "Agni, take a few steps back and wait by the entrance door for now." Agni, his wolf companion, let out a low growl of displeasure, clearly eager for a fight. Despite his frustration, the wolf obeyed, retreating to the door and settling his large frame beside it with a huff. With that taken care of, Roland turned his attention to the chamber before him. There were exactly 200 statues in the area, with the towering giant at the far end rounding out the number. "I suppose once they're triggered, I'll have to fight through a few waves before the big one gets involved." He was in luck. This entire chamber was laced with his specialty, runic symbols and magic. While the design here was far more intricate than the simpler Albrook dungeon he had previously explored, Roland was confident in his ability to decipher it. The statues weren't ordinary constructs. His keen eye detected the faint glow of hidden runes etched across their surfaces. They were runic golems, crafted from various types of stone, including the ominous obsidian ones. Those runes were likely the key to defeating them. The biggest problem will be that giant one, he muttered, his visor flashing as he studied the massive figure in the distance. Its rune structure is a lot more complex than the smaller ones. I don't think I'll be able to crack its code before it attacks me, which leaves me with a few options. Roland possessed the ability to control runic constructs and golems. In theory, he should be able to wrestle control of these golems from the dungeon's grasp. However, their sheer number presented a massive challenge. To make matters worse, they didn't follow a uniform runic sequence, further complicating the task. Roland quickly realized that trying to dominate all of them simultaneously would demand an immense amount of mana and razor-sharp precision. Even for him, the risk of overloading his senses was great, as he had never attempted a hostile takeover on such a scale before. 50 of them is probably my limit. If I add my own golems, it should suffice. He wondered as a plan took shape in his mind. The massive statue wasn't the only problem. The real obstacle lay in the throne it was seated upon. From his analysis, this was the control console for the entire golem army. Unfortunately, it was out of his reach for the moment. Even if he managed to gain access, taking over the giant statue might prove impossible. For now, his best option was to clear the area and study the throne further. Perhaps in the future, this chamber could be farmed for valuable resources. As Roland examined the enemies more closely, he identified the smaller golems as Tier 3 adjacent entities, their bodies far tougher than anything a typical Tier 2 class holder could handle. The materials they were constructed from, obsidian and high-density stone, made them durable and dangerous. Only the massive statue at the back was a true Tier 3 threat, far stronger than the monsters he had faced in the temple. Obsidian Golem Guard L149. High Stone Golem Guard L149. These lesser golems, while classified as guards, were formidable due to their construction. Their high durability elevated them to pseudo-Tier 3 status, though they lacked the power of a true Tier 3. The leader, however, was an entirely different beast. Obsidian Golem High Lord L230. Its glowing eyes locked onto Roland, an unmistakable sign of its awareness. The High Lord sat motionless on its throne, radiating an aura of power that dwarfed its subordinates. For now, it remained idle, but Roland knew that once he made his move, the entire chamber would spring to life. Good, Agni. Woof. I have a plan, let's do this. Awoo. Agni perked up as Roland finally decided to make his move. After a brief moment of calculation, he activated his spatial runes, summoning his small contingent of golem troops. First came the floating golems, some shaped like cubes and others more octagonal. They hovered silently above his head, ensuring they didn't touch any of the intricate runes on the chamber floor. Next came the spider golems, which skittered out from the spatial runes. Due to the limited space near the entrance, they crowded against Agni, much to the wolf's displeasure. Agni growled softly, shifting uncomfortably as the metal constructs bumped into his body, but Roland paid it no mind. The force wasn't large, just 20 floating golems designed for ranged support and another 20 spider golems, still in need of further upgrades. Though not at their full potential, they would serve their purpose. Now, the real task began, stepping forward to wrest control of some of the dungeon's golems and turning them against their allies. Roland's gaze flicked toward the nearest guard golems. Each was equipped with a shield and spear. Choosing which ones to dominate required little deliberation. The obsidian golems were clearly the most durable and imposing of the group. Roland began channeling his runic magic, his armor pulsing with power as he activated the intricate circuits smithied into its surface. His visor flared with data, displaying the complex structures of the obsidian golems nearest to him. With a deep breath, Roland extended his hand, using rune authority to take over the golemic constructs. The skill struck the first golem, its obsidian body trembling as the dungeon's control system clashed against Roland's will. Sparks of mana erupted from its joints, but the conflict was brief. Moments later, the glowing runes on its body dimmed, replaced by the soft blue hue of Roland's magic. One by one, Roland repeated the process, each success boosting his confidence. By the time he finished, 5 obsidian golems stood at attention, their glowing eyes now under Roland's control. Though the process strained his mana reserves, the payoff was undeniable. The obsidian golem's shields shimmered briefly with runic traces before the glow subsided, signifying the completion of his takeover. Encouraged, Roland pressed on, his runic program spreading like a virus through the dormant ranks. Another 5 golems fell under his command, their rigid postures shifting as they aligned themselves with their new master. Each additional golem drained his MP further, the cost weighing heavily on his reserves. He knew the strain would persist until he relinquished control, but the tactical advantage was worth the sacrifice. Agni, get ready, they're coming. Agni's ears perked up, and the wolf lowered his body into a defensive stance, a low growl rumbling in his throat. By the time Roland had infiltrated the systems of around 20 golems, the dungeon retaliated. A faint tremor ran through the chamber as the remaining rocky soldiers began to stir. Their once dormant forms came to life, the runes carved into their bodies flaring to life with a crimson glow. One by one, their eyes locked onto Roland, their movements growing as the dungeon's defensive mechanisms fully engaged. The chamber erupted in a grating sound of grinding stone and hissing mana as the enemy golems fully activated. Their eyes, blazing crimson, locked onto Roland and his allies. The dungeon's defenses roared to life, an overwhelming tide of runic magic animating the statues into deadly warriors. Roland wasted no time. With a single command, his 20 dominated obsidian golems moved into formation, their massive shields locking together in unison. The result was an impenetrable defensive wall that braced against the advancing horde. Behind them, the floating golems took their positions, hovering above the shield wall. Their rune-etched forms began to glow as they charged up mana projectiles, ready to unleash a volley at Roland's signal. Spider golems, spread out. Lay down suppression fire. The spider golems sprang into action, their articulated legs tapping against the obsidian floor as they skittered to the edges of the chamber. Some began scaling the walls, using their limbs to secure their positions by digging in. Once in place, they aimed their cannons at the advancing rocky golems. A salvo of magical projectiles erupted from the spider golems, streaking through the chamber and colliding with the dungeon's constructs. The impact didn't destroy the enemy golems outright, but visible cracks began to spread across their hardened surfaces. Despite their resilience, the sustained bombardment from the spider golems was wearing them down, slowly tipping the balance in Roland's favor. Agni remained behind the defending line of golems but shifted into his tankier red ruby form. His flames subdued, and his fur was replaced by shimmering crimson crystals. With a deep growl, he opened his mouth, releasing a surge of fiery energy. The blast seared through the advancing army, melting their bodies and destroying several in the process. This would be easier if I could just eradicate all the runes at once. Roland thought, his mind racing as he assessed the situation. He had considered it before, but there were simply too many runes, and the dungeon was actively resisting his magic. It was as if the very essence of the place was fighting back, preventing him from spreading his influence as freely as he would have liked. In theory, if he could disrupt the runes on these monsters, they would revert to nothing more than lifeless statues. But with so many golems activating at once, it was impossible to control or affect them all at once. For now, his only option was to continue taking over the golems one by one. However, he soon realized that his initial estimate of 50 was far too high. After successfully controlling 44 of the golems, Roland felt his mana reserves dangerously depleting. He needed to stop before pushing any further as it risked overwhelming him. Agni, use the golems as cover and try to keep your distance, if you get too close you might get overwhelmed. Roland drew his hammer and shield, deciding to conserve the rest of his magical energy. Controlling so many golems at once had taken a heavy toll on his mana, reducing it by more than half. As long as the connection remained active alongside his rune authority, he wouldn't be able to regain mana, even with a potion. The battlefield soon erupted in magical explosions and the sound of shattering rock as the golems collided with one another. Roland swung his hammer with precision, aiming for the legs of the advancing rocky guards. Each strike sent a ripple through their sturdy forms, breaking them apart. Agni, standing beside him, unleashed a mix of long-range flame attacks and close-quarter strikes with his ruby tail, which like a whip caused massive damage. The fight raged on for several minutes, each moment a careful balancing act of offense and defense. Then, from the distance, a deep rumble shook the chamber. Roland's eyes shifted toward the source. The massive, towering golem statue was beginning to stir. The ground beneath Roland's feet trembled as the massive golem statue slowly began to move. The colossal figure, which had been sitting immobile on its obsidian throne, shifted with terrifying slowness, its enormous stone limbs creaking with each motion. The stone surrounding its feet cracked as it stood, its glowing eyes flaring to life with an ominous red hue. Roland's pulse quickened as he surveyed the battlefield. The other golems were still locked in fierce combat, and only half of the enemy forces had been defeated. He had known the large golem would eventually be triggered, but he had hoped to clear the area before it came to life. Now, he faced the towering behemoth with only half of his mana remaining and part of his golem army damaged. Agni, I'll leave the small fry to you and the golems. Awoo! Agni responded eagerly, his tail flicking as he darted behind the defensive line of golems, staying low to the ground. Roland, however, stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the advancing giant. The colossal golem moved slowly but with purpose. Rising from its throne, it grasped a massive scepter made of black rock, its spiked crown giving it a regal, almost intimidating appearance. The scepter and crown marked it as the golem's true leader, a king among the stone warriors. Now that the towering golem stood before him, Roland was able to properly gauge its true height, nearly 9 meters. This was truly a colossal foe, the largest monster he had ever encountered in his life. However, despite its size and power, the golem had a clear weakness, its agility. The creature's movements were slow and awkward, making its actions easy to predict. When the golem swung its massive scepter, it did so with a wide, telegraphed motion, one that Roland could easily react to. The impact of the swing generated a violent gust of wind, sending shards of rock flying in all directions. Roland quickly raised a well-placed mana shield, deflecting the debris and bracing for the next strike. Behind him, he saw some of the sharp rocks collide with a few golem guards, tearing through them like Swiss cheese. Upon witnessing this, he had a bright idea. Instead of targeting the monster's joints, as adventurers often did when battling other large golems, he slammed his tower shield to draw the monster's attention. The large creature focused on him but remained stationary, just as he had hoped. Predictably, it unleashed the same cone-shaped attack in his direction. Systematically he would block the shards while placing himself in front of the other living statues. As Roland maintained his strategic position, he continued to bait the massive golem into launching its destructive cone-shaped attacks. Each swing of its colossal scepter sent a rain of sharp debris in his direction, but Roland's tower shield absorbed all of the impacts while hitting the enemies with friendly fire. The enemy numbers were rapidly dwindling, and he continued to defend himself like a turtle, steadfast and unyielding. The battlefield was a storm of calculated chaos. The obsidian golems under Roland's control held their ground, forming an impenetrable wall of shields and spears. Behind them, floating golems unleashed concentrated mana bolts, each strike illuminating the chaos with brief flashes of blue light. Meanwhile, spider golems continued their relentless flanking maneuvers, their cannons chipping away at the weakened foes. With the large boss golem's assistance, the tide of battle turned swiftly, and soon, their enemies were no more, leaving the massive golem lord standing alone before them. Agni, target its lower body while I draw it away. The cost of victory had been steep. His troop of rock golems had been reduced to just 10 out of the 40 he'd started with. The spider golems had also taken heavy damage, their shattered metal parts littered the ground. Only the floating golems, too small to be targeted effectively, remained mostly intact. They hovered in the air, relentlessly attacking the golem lord, which swatted at them like they were nothing more than bothersome mosquitoes. The tide of battle seemed to be turning in his favor, and Roland decided it was time to act. After downing a mana potion, his power surged, and his body became enveloped in a haze of crimson energy. Like an arrow loosed from a crossbow, he shot forward, his hammer striking the monster's ankle with immense force. Bolstered by his overlord's might skill, the thick stone leg began to crack and, before long, shattered entirely. The monster turned to face him but stumbled forward, its balance compromised by the loss of its foot. Roland leapt back as it struggled to remain upright. Unable to support itself, the creature collapsed onto its knees, the impact causing a slight cracking sound as it hit the unyielding obsidian ground. Seizing the opportunity, Roland lunged forward again, this time aiming directly for the monster's hidden core, which, for some reason, was located beneath its armpit. With one good hit from his hammer, the sound of shattering stone echoed through the chamber as Roland's hammer struck true. A pulse of energy rippled outward from the golem's armpit, a sign that the impact had destabilized its core. The towering figure froze mid-motion, its crimson eyes dimming to a lifeless black. For a brief moment, silence reigned in the chamber and it seemed that the battle was over, but then, out of nowhere the throne began to glow. Roland watched as the throne's glow intensified, arcane energy crackling across the chamber. From the shattered remains of defeated golems, a new adversary began to emerge. The fragments coalesced into a pile of jagged rocks around the fallen lord, pulsating with a strange energy that mimicked a heartbeat. This doesn't look good, that's a lot of magic. Agni, stay behind me. This might be dangerous. Woof. The pile of shattered golem fragments writhed as though alive, and the entire chamber began to tremble. Roland braced himself, tightening his grip on his hammer. The glowing fragments spiraled upward, drawn into a vortex forming above the remains of the defeated golem lord. Crimson energy seeped from the cracks in the obsidian floor, converging into a semi-humanoid shape that pulsed with raw power. He considered interrupting the process but had no idea how. Reaching out with his runic spells proved futile, the concentration of energy was far too extreme for him to disrupt. Is this new opponent really this strong, or is the dungeon preventing me from interfering? He wondered, uncertain but wary. He couldn't influence the transformation as the magical power that was being displayed was far above his. Without delay, he pulled a high-grade mana potion from his pouch and downed it, restoring his reserves. I didn't think this thing would have a second phase, especially with all these monsters still around. Roland steadied himself for the next round, his muscles tense and his mind racing. For a fleeting moment, doubt crept in, was this going to be more than he could handle? If all the energy from the defeated golems in the chamber had truly combined, then the creature forming before him would be something extraordinary, perhaps even 100 levels beyond his own. Yet, as the energy began to settle, he noticed something odd. The surge in power wasn't as overwhelming as he had anticipated. It's strong, but not impossible. The monster continued to take shape, but Roland didn't simply stand idle. He ordered his floating golems to pull back and form a defensive perimeter around him. As he activated his rapid machine reassembly skill, the shattered remains of his spider golems responded instantly. Metallic fragments clicked and snapped into place, reconstructing themselves into fully functional units. His reinforcements were back in action, ready to fight. However, the golems he had commandeered from the dungeon were gone, their remnants absorbed as fuel for the monstrosity still forming in the chamber. The loss was frustrating, but Roland knew it was out of his hands now. Instead, he focused on taking out a few items from within his inventory, runic spheres and even cards. After tossing them out in various directions, he was finally confronted by his next enemy, the true boss of this area. Lord of Fury L240. Never heard of such a monster before. Throughout his life, Roland had pored over countless books detailing monsters, records of their strengths, weaknesses and how best to confront them. He had always believed preparation was the key to survival. Yet, the entity forming before him was something entirely foreign. There were no descriptions, no recorded strategies, nothing to indicate what he was about to face. It must be a unique dungeon boss. The thought was both unsettling and exhilarating. On one hand, it meant he had no insight into its weaknesses or behavior, he'd be fighting blind. On the other hand, being the first to defeat a dungeon's undiscovered boss carried the promise of extraordinary rewards. Rare loot, powerful artifacts, or unique skill books often awaited those who cleared uncharted chambers. But the danger was quite real. This anomaly, a second phase triggered after the defeat of the golem army, would likely have spelled doom for many adventurers. Most would have entered the chamber prepared only for the small army of golems and then probably perished due to being underprepared. Luckily, he was a one-man army, able to restore defeated golems multiple times and with several potions and elixirs to restore his health. Soon, the monster stood before him, a towering creature encased in obsidian armor, radiating a strange crimson glow. Its lower body resembled that of an armored warhorse, massive and imposing, while its upper half was shaped like a knight clad in heavy, dark plate. Crimson smoke coiled and seeped from within its armor, wafting ominously through the air and spilling from the gaps in its jagged visor. In its hands, the beast wielded two long, menacing sabers. The blades, forged from the same dark material as its armor, shimmered with glowing runes that pulsed faintly with power. Its level is only 10 above the Golem Lord, but it's much stronger than that. Roland's instincts screamed that the numbers didn't tell the full story. While he couldn't directly read the creature's stats, the overwhelming magic aura it radiated told him everything he needed to know. This was no ordinary level increase. The oppressive energy surrounding it was enormous, a clear sign that the creature had some sort of enhanced stat multiplier. Just like my Overlord class. This creature was a step above the Lord he had faced earlier, but not so far ahead that he couldn't handle it. While its stat multiplier was clearly higher, Roland estimated it was closer to Agni's level of enhancement rather than his own Overlord class amplification. Even so, he knew better than to underestimate it. It's probably stronger than any of the knight commanders I've faced before, but... The monster was finally there, its glowing visor forming a strange, singular eye that fixed its gaze in his direction. Roland's sharp eye had already picked out some flaws in the creature. One of them was its horse-like body. While this form offered certain advantages, it also came with some weakness. If its legs sustained enough damage, the monster could potentially collapse under its own massive weight. Then there was the more glaring vulnerability, the runes etched across its body. These radiated a faint, ominous glow, and Roland realized they might be exploitable, if he had enough time to study their structure. Rune Authority doesn't seem to be working well on these things. He had already tried to take control of the creature's runes, as he had with the lesser golems, but to no avail. Something was interfering with his ability to manipulate them. Perhaps it was the dungeon itself, or maybe the monster possessed its own innate control over the runes. After all, they weren't external tools wielded by an adventurer, they were an intrinsic part of the creature's form. As the Lord of Fury fully emerged, the chamber seemed to darken, the faint glow of its runes casting ominous red light onto the shattered remains of the previous battle. Roland steadied himself, the weight of his hammer reassuring in his grip. The Obsidian Knight raised its sabers in a cross-like stance, a low, menacing sound emanating from within its armor, whether a roar or a taunt, Roland couldn't tell. Then, suddenly the monster charged at an astonishing speed, a blur of crimson left behind as it galloped. While this monster was only 3 meters tall and smaller than the Golem Lord, he could not underestimate its power. The Lord of Fury's sudden burst of speed was unexpected for a creature of its size. Its crimson sabers glowed ominously as it closed the distance in an instant, bringing both weapons down in a deadly arc. Roland rolled to the side just in time, avoiding the twin strikes as they smashed into the obsidian floor, sending cracks radiating outward. "It's fast and bulky, great!" Roland muttered under his breath, steadying himself as the monster turned to face him once more. It paused briefly before turning around and moving in a semicircle. Then it charged at him again with the same explosive speed as before. Though its horse-like body was cumbersome for tight maneuvers, its linear bursts of speed were nearly impossible to counter. If he tried to block with his shield, he risked being trampled, even if he reinforced it with spells. The size of the boss arena only added to the challenge, offering the massive creature plenty of room to maneuver despite its lack of lateral agility. He had no intention of letting this monster charge at him unopposed. The creature resembled a runic machine, seemingly powered by the dungeon itself. Roland could sense a connection to the throne behind him, and it was clear the monster had access to more mana than even he could muster. Acting swiftly, he commanded the golems flanking him to barrage the beast with mana projectiles, hoping to at least divert its attention away from him. The battlefield erupted in chaos once again as the floating and spider golems responded to Roland's command. A storm of mana projectiles rained down on the Lord of Fury, streaking through the air in glowing arcs. The Obsidian Knight twisted its armored body to deflect the onslaught with its sabers, each blade moving with impossible precision to swat away the incoming attacks. However, even the monstrous knight couldn't avoid every strike. Some projectiles collided with its armor, sending sparks rippling across its dark surface. No apparent damage could be seen, but even a few points of HP damage would amount to something eventually. The creature slowed momentarily, its sabers spinning defensively in a blur of crimson light, but the sheer volume of projectiles forced it to turn and focus on the smaller enemies. It charged forth with astonishing speed, the sabers producing strange half-moon energy blasts that traveled in the direction of the floating golems and the spider ones stuck to the walls. The floating golems, nimble and evasive, darted to avoid the onslaught, but several were caught in the crossfire. One by one, they shattered into glowing shards of metal and magic, their remnants clattering to the ground. The spider golems clinging to the walls fared no better. The energy blades from the sabers carved through the obsidian walls, causing chunks of rock to fall and several spider golems to lose their grip. They tumbled to the ground, some reduced to broken fragments, while others scrambled to reassemble themselves using Roland's rapid machine reassembly skill. Roland took advantage of the chaos, analyzing the Lord of Fury's movements. Its attacks were formidable, but each strike came with a predictable wind-up. The crimson glow on its sabers intensified just before it unleashed an energy wave, and its charges were always telegraphed by the heavy clattering of its horse-like hooves. "Agni, aim for the legs but keep your distance and keep moving. It's fast but has trouble turning." Awoo! Agni was there too, and his ranged attacks packed more power than the golems. The wolf opened his muzzle and unleashed a beam of concentrated heat that struck one of the monster's hind legs while it focused on the golems. In retaliation, the creature shot out energy blades in Agni's direction. Reacting swiftly, Agni leapt into the air, conjuring platforms beneath him to evade the attack at the last moment. Although his agility was impressive, his level still left much to be desired. Roland knew that even a single hit from those crimson, crescent-shaped projectiles would likely be fatal for his companion. Driven by fear for Agni's safety, Roland used his own magic and sacrificed golems to intercept some of the deadly blades, ensuring the wolf wouldn't suffer during the intense confrontation. The Lord of Fury's relentless assault left no moment to catch a breath. Each swing of its sabers, each thunderous charge, sent tremors through the battlefield. Roland's mind raced, calculating possibilities while ensuring that Agni and the remaining golems could continue their offensive. As the monster turned its attention toward Agni, Roland saw an opportunity. His body started glowing, a blue haze surrounding it as the world turned into mana around him. Previously he had already used up his overlord's might to destroy the first phase, and this would have to be enough for the second one. The monster's movements had now become clear to him, and with the help of the mana phantom, he knew that he could deliver a devastating blow. It's going to be there in a few moments. He knew exactly where to aim. The runes on his armor began to glow intensely as the chest section expanded outward. A high-pitched whine filled the air, rising in pitch as Roland's chest plate unfolded, revealing an octagonal device radiating a pulsating, brilliant blue light. This was the improved beam device, a prototype he had painstakingly crafted. The previous model had served him well, and he was confident this upgraded version would not fail him now. The octagonal core extended slightly, while portions of his armor fanned out to the sides, revealing intricate runes etched into the plates. At the center of the device, a single crystal glimmered, drawing in an immense amount of energy. Power surged around it, coalescing into a dense, glowing sphere. This was his enhanced beam weapon, designed using advanced techniques he had recently learned at the Institute. It had been built specifically to face a potential boss monster. Now, he would see if it lived up to the legacy of the old model that had saved his life countless times before. A mana circle appeared before the beam, a magic enhancement spell that would give it the penetrative power that he needed. Soon he made the calculations, and as the monster focused on Agni and the golems, he aimed for the area it would be in the next second. The Lord of Fury barreled forward, its sabers raised high as it closed in on Agni, oblivious to the silent power being harnessed behind it. Roland steadied his aim, his enhanced beam device locked onto the monster's broad, equine midsection, the largest and most vulnerable part of its body. In that split second, he unleashed the stored energy. The chamber was bathed in brilliant blue light as the beam shot forth, ripping through the air with a deafening roar. Initially, it was no thicker than a teacup, but as it passed through the magical enhancement circle, it expanded dramatically in size and intensity. The circle amplified the beam's speed, power, and penetrative force to extraordinary levels. The beam struck true, slamming into the Lord of Fury's midsection just as it raised its sabers to strike at Agni, who was darting through the air with incredible agility. The Lord of Fury let out a deafening roar as the beam tore through its midsection, obliterating the rear parts of its body and sending it crashing into the nearby wall due to the momentum. Crimson energy erupted violently, spewing from the gaping wound left by the beam. The force of the attack sent shockwaves rippling through the chamber, shattering remnants of walls and scattering debris across the battlefield. Roland held his ground as the light from the beam dissipated, his armor smoking from the residual heat of the attack. In the past, the crystal within his chest would have cracked by now, but this time around, it persisted. The battlefield fell eerily silent for a moment, the oppressive crimson light dimming slightly as the aftermath of the devastating beam attack settled. Dust and debris floated through the air, illuminated by the faint glow of the chamber's remaining runes. Roland steadied his breath, his eyes locked on the motionless form of the Lord of Fury. Its midsection was utterly obliterated, its once massive equine body reduced to jagged shards of obsidian that scattered across the chamber. Weak sparks of red energy flickered around the ruined remnants of its lower body. For a moment, it seemed as though the battle might be over, but Roland's instincts screamed otherwise. Agni growled low, ears pinned back, as the shattered remains of the monster began to stir once more. Grrrrrrr. It's getting back up. Though severed in half, the knight's upper body remained connected to the forelegs. Those limbs began to twist unnaturally, bending at impossible angles. New joints formed and locked into place, transforming them into legs powerful enough to lift the upper half of the creature upright. Its grotesque new form resembled that of a minotaur. The runes on its twin sabers flared to life, glowing with ominous energy. With a roar, the creature charged forward once more, undeterred by its wounds and seemingly determined to take him out. This day is full of surprises. While it remained standing, its speed had dramatically decreased, it could no longer zip toward him with its previous ferocity. Finally, Roland raised his shield to meet its attack. One of the swords connected with the shield, producing a burst of magical energy that cracked the very ground beneath his feet. Yet, he didn't retreat. Though the attack was powerful, Roland held firm. His shield absorbed the brunt of the blow, but vibrations rattled through his body. He gritted his teeth as his reinforced armor groaned under the strain. With a powerful shove, he deflected the blade to the side, throwing the Lord of Fury off balance for a split second. The monster staggered back a few steps before surging forward again, the runes on its blades glowing brightly, ready to unleash crimson half-moon energy. However, as it swung down, something strange happened. Its weapon failed to produce the expected effect, as though an unseen force was blocking its power. Finally, that should make it a lot easier. Roland grinned. Rune Authority had finally started to work. Though it had taken some time, he had begun to unravel the monster's intricate rune structures mid-battle. The process had been slow, as the Lord of Fury's runes were deeply entrenched and fiercely protected by the dungeon's magical network. But now, after the devastating beam strike and the loss of its original form, the creature's defenses had weakened, allowing Roland's skill to disrupt the flow of power within the runes. The monster hesitated, its movements momentarily erratic. Crimson energy flickered unpredictably across its weapons and armor, and the glow of its runes dimmed. The knight's once menacing aura felt unstable, as if its power was beginning to falter. It was clear that the monster was not expecting this turn of events and that perhaps its inner programming was not prepared for such an occasion. This is my chance. With its saber runes deactivated, the Lord of Fury's attacks lost much of their lethality. Though it swung its blades with unrelenting ferocity, the absence of the rune enhancements left its strikes no more potent than those of ordinary weapons. Roland dodged nimbly, sidestepping the creature's heavy, telegraphed swings and countering with precise blows aimed at its now exposed joints. As with any other creature, the mana phantoms allowed him to anticipate its movements before they were carried out. What had begun as a chaotic battle had shifted into a more controlled exchange of physical blows, one that Roland was starting to dominate. His status window kept updating, notifying him of level UPS to both his passive fighting skills and active abilities almost instantly. A foe 40 levels above him was indeed a formidable challenge, but in its current diminished form, the Lord of Fury had become merely troublesome. His golems once reformed again and aided him by blasting the monster from multiple angles, creating constant distractions and breaking its focus. Each mana projectile found its mark, striking the creature's cracked armor and further destabilizing its form. Agni capitalized on the chaos, darting in and out of range, his fiery attacks burning through weakened plates and exposing raw less hardened rocky flesh. The monster was fascinating. Externally, it was heavily armored, but internally, it seemed to be composed of some form of living mineral. Roland was eager to study this creature, along with the other rocky golems he had encountered. Its power was undeniable, and he realized that without his army of golems and a generous supply of mana-restoring potions, the battle would have been far more challenging. If the creature hadn't shifted its focus to other targets, he likely wouldn't have been able to execute his beam attack so effectively. The battlefield now belonged to Roland. With each passing moment, the creature's movements slowed, its power fading as the crimson runes sputtered out one by one. Roland could see the cracks widening along its remaining limbs, faint pulses of crimson energy leaking out like blood. It was unraveling. Let's end this. Although he was winning, Roland had already restored his golems multiple times, and their quality had dropped by 2 grades. His mana reserves were dwindling, and consuming more potions would only raise the toxicity levels in his body. While this world operated with a game-like system, he couldn't endlessly refill his MP and HP with potions, there was always a limit. Fortunately, the monster before him was beginning to crumble, and the time had come to deliver the final blow. The runes on his hammer flared to life, glowing as arcs of blue lightning crackled along its surface. With a powerful leap, he launched himself forward, targeting the monster's head as it staggered backward, hindered by Agni's teeth tearing into its hind leg. With a devastating strike, his hammer connected, and the monster's head exploded in a spray of debris. From within, a crimson orb emerged, the monster's core, its only true weak point. Roland extended his hand, his gauntlet glowing with magical energy as he prepared to destroy the core with a spell. But at the last second, he hesitated. Instead of unleashing a torrent of magic, he cast a mage hand spell, catching the core in midair and drawing it closer. Encasing it in a protective layer of mana, he successfully disabled it, preserving it for further study. This was a golem core, similar to the ones he had worked on in the past. While its grade went above the simple volcanic golem cores he learned to wipe, the basics were the same. He knew what to disable to defeat the monster. He just needed a few moments to sever the signals it was sending to the body parts to prevent it from reforming. Soon, the monster parts that were burning with crimson energy started to dim, and he had won this battle of attrition. Lord of Fury has been slain. Congratulations, you have leveled up. Congratulations, you have leveled up. Congratulations, you have leveled up. Multiple system messages erupted before him as the monster crumbled to the ground. His level shot past 200, and along with the milestone came a new skill. Overlord's Regal Resilience. Passive skill L1. Increases the Overlord's mental fortitude, making them resistant to various forms of magical and non-magical effects aimed at control. At first glance, the new skill didn't seem particularly impressive, but it subtly enhanced his already formidable mental fortitude. Roland wondered if it would be enough to counter something as potent as an Abyssal Cult's illusion relic, as the description seemed to suggest. The mention of non-magical effects likely extended to intimidation-based abilities used by both monsters and certain classes. For instance, something like Intimidating Shout, a common skill known for rooting its target in place for several seconds, could render even seasoned warriors defenseless, leaving them open to attack. If Regal Resilience provided resistance to such debilitating effects, it could prove invaluable in future battles where his armor was damaged. Roland stood amidst the shattered remains of the battlefield, his breathing steady but heavy. The Lord of Fury's disintegrated form was scattered across the chamber, its once imposing presence reduced to rubble and faintly glowing fragments. In his hand, he held the ultimate prize, a fully intact core containing the monster's magic program. With this core, he had the potential to recreate the Lord of Fury as his own golem. Replicating the runic magic it utilized wouldn't be overly challenging, and such a construct could prove to be a powerful future asset. However, the Lord of Fury was a high-level Tier 3 monster with exceptional stats. Reconstructing it would demand costly materials to maintain its original performance. Using lesser resources might render the recreated golem weaker, incapable of matching its previous might in battle. I wonder if we could use something like this to bolster Albrook's forces. He wondered, turning his gaze to the remains of the other rocky golems. Several fragmented cores peeked out from the rubble. Though most were shattered, Roland believed he could salvage enough pieces to reconstruct their operating systems. These humanoid golems were far less advanced than the Lord of Fury, but they were still functional. Better yet, they could be assembled with Tier 2 materials, resources he could mine directly from this cave. Compared to hiring more soldiers, these golems were cost-effective. They even retained the ability to maintain basic formations, making them a viable option for bolstering Albrook's defenses. With enough effort, Roland envisioned assembling an entire troop of these golems, a force under his complete command. This was all just speculation for now. Roland wasn't sure how effectively he could process the obsidian rock scattered throughout the area, nor how much of it was actually stored here. Being in the boss chamber made mining a risky endeavor. If the boss respawned suddenly and the door sealed behind the workers, it could prove disastrous. Before anything else, he needed to secure the floor and assemble a teleportation gate to bring workers safely into the area. However, the materials the golems were made of were still present. Each time the boss respawned, it would provide him and Albrook with a wealth of parts to recreate these golems, assuming he figured out how to replicate their bodies. So far, he had only worked with metals, not rocks. If he went through with this plan, it would be his first time creating a mineral-based golem rather than one resembling a mechanical construct. Woof! While he was contemplating on the use of all these monster drops, Agni started to bark. What is it, boy? He turned to his companion, following the wolf's gaze to the large throne where the boss's first form had been seated. Though still intact, the runes on its surface were beginning to glow, making his heart sink. A dreadful thought crossed his mind. Was the boss not truly defeated? Could there be yet another third phase awaiting him? Wait, this is different. Letting out a sigh of relief, he focused on the throne, which was now trembling. It wasn't a magical reaction but a mechanical one, the throne itself was beginning to move. He braced himself, suspecting that the dungeon had more in store for him and this was not the last level. His intuition proved correct as a new path revealed itself. At the same time, the large door through which he had entered began to open, much like any other cleared boss chamber would. The throne continued to move slowly until he heard it grind to a halt. Behind it there was a hole now with dark stairs leading down somewhere. Roland slowly moved closer to check the newly revealed path. Agni padded beside him, ears pricked and tail low, clearly sensing the tension in the air. The dark staircase descended sharply into the unknown, its edges worn smooth as though countless feet had traversed it over the centuries. Faint, flickering runes adorned the walls, their light casting eerie shadows that danced in rhythmic patterns. Does it lead to a lower floor or is it something else? Roland held himself back, carefully analyzing the boss chamber. Something was bothering him. Even after defeating the guardian of this room, no reward had been granted. When he had defeated the golem in the Albrook dungeon, he had been rewarded with a chest containing Agni's egg. Here, however, there was nothing of the sort. It was uncharacteristic for a dungeon not to provide a reward upon clearing a boss, though he knew there were rare exceptions. Tisk. He clicked his tongue, unwilling to believe this might be one of those exceptions. Before moving forward, he sent out another wave of mana to restore the broken golems to a semi-functional state. Then, he retrieved his foldable briefcase and set it on the ground. The chamber was littered with valuable materials, and he directed the golems to collect them and deposit them into his spatial storage while he prepared to investigate the level below. Let's go, Agni. Roland sounded a bit irritated as he stepped onto the staircase. The air was heavy, charged with mana particles that clung to the walls. Agni moved silently at his side, his glowing eyes flickering. The faint clink of collected materials echoed from behind, where the golems diligently salvaged the remains of the battlefield. The descent was steep and disorienting, the faint light of the runes the only guide through the encroaching darkness. After what felt like an eternity, the stairs ended abruptly, opening into a vast, circular chamber. It was unlike anything Roland had seen before. The room was filled with treasures beyond imagination, golden artifacts, sparkling gemstones, intricately crafted weapons, and armors that radiated a faint magical aura. The chamber glimmered as though the walls themselves were alive, reflecting the treasure's brilliance in an endless loop of light. Yet, instead of elation, Roland felt only disappointment. His chest tightened as he surveyed the room, searching in vain for a path leading further in. There was none. This appeared to be the end of the dungeon, a treasure room meant to mark its conclusion. According to the records of this world, such chambers served as the final reward for defeating the dungeon's guardian. His gaze swept over the magical artifacts scattered throughout the room. Most were unremarkable in quality, primarily high Tier 2 items with a sparse handful of Tier 3 among them. The centerpiece was a large axe displayed prominently on the wall, forged from a gleaming golden material that radiated a potent magical energy. Is this really it? While these items would fetch a hefty price and temporarily ease his monetary troubles, Roland had been expecting something more, a path to a greater dungeon. As it stood, the monsters on this floor offered little value in terms of experience, most of them hadn't even reached level 200, a threshold he had now surpassed. The only creature that could potentially aid his progression had been the boss he'd just defeated. However, he knew all too well that it would likely take at least a week for the boss to respawn. If he used it to level, it would take him forever and eventually, he would not be able to progress any further. He glanced at his current level, which had shot up quickly after clearing out all those monsters. Name: Roland Arden, L204. Classes: T3 Runesmith Overlord, L29 Primary. T2 Runesmith Lord, L50 Tertiary. T2 Runic Engineer, L50 Secondary. T1 Mage, L25X. T1 Runic Mana Scribe, L25X. T1 Runic Blacksmith, L25X. One of the problems was also boss quality. He was sure that the next time he attempted, the next monster would be weaker, perhaps just the first phase and nothing more. While this wasn't bad, he still wished for something more. However, he hadn't just given up, his life already showed him that these dungeons aren't that simple and anomalies sometimes arise. Thus he started searching, going through the chamber and examining the walls for any potential pathways. Perhaps just like the throne's movement had unveiled a hidden path, there could be more concealed mechanisms within the treasure room. Roland moved systematically, running his fingers along the cold, rune-inscribed walls, his mana sense extended to detect any fluctuations. The faint static sound permeated the room, but he didn't seem to be able to find anything out of place. Agni prowled beside him, sniffing the air and occasionally pawing at the ground as if sensing something amiss. Roland glanced at his companion, who was acting more alert than usual. "You sense something, boy?" Roland asked, crouching to examine the floor near where Agni had paused. The runes on the wall seemed ordinary and mostly decorative, rather than functional. But the mana flow in the room felt off, as though it wasn't simply dispersing but flowing from elsewhere. What if I? An idea clicked into place. Roland turned his attention to the mana currents. Using his runic skills and mana detection, he focused on the subtle movements of energy in the room. The treasure piles glittered enticingly, but he ignored them, concentrating on the faintest traces of mana. He noticed a pattern, streams of energy converging at a point halfway up the wall on the far side of the chamber. He approached the wall, inspecting it closely. To the naked eye, there was nothing unusual about it, just more smooth stone adorned with decorative runes. But when Roland channeled mana into the wall, the runes began to glow faintly, revealing a hidden connection. The source of magic is flowing out of this spot. There has to be something behind this wall, but there doesn't seem to be an opening mechanism anywhere. He wasn't sure what was behind this wall, but he was inclined to believe that it was worth checking out. It was certainly not something that the dungeon wanted him to discover, as it lacked a runic opening mechanism as in the Albrook dungeon. Instead, he would need to force his way in and create a path of his own. "Step back, Agni, we're going through." "Awoo." Agni watched intently as Roland pulled a large drill device from his spatial storage, a tool similar to the one he had used to create the tunnel connecting his house to the dungeon. Channeling his mana into the machine, the drill's end began to spin quickly. With confidence, he pressed it against the wall and started pushing, but to his surprise, the wall wasn't budging. "What is this thing made of?" Despite multiple attempts, the drill began to overheat, smoke curling from its mechanisms. The wall remained largely intact, with only a fist-sized hole left behind for all his efforts. The drill itself was on the verge of breaking apart, its durability pushed to its limits. Whatever lay on the other side, it would take more than a simple drill to unearth, or just one made from better materials. Roland frowned, stepping back to examine the stubborn wall that had resisted even his high-grade runic drill. The composition of the stone was unusual. While it appeared smooth and rune-inscribed like the rest of the dungeon, its durability far exceeded anything he had encountered before. Even the Lord of Fury's body armor hadn't been this resilient. Looks like this might take some time. While brute force didn't seem to be working, there wasn't really an alternative. He had examined the runes on the walls and searched the entire corridor, but there were no hidden passages he could detect. Destroying the walls was the only option left. However, he had no way of knowing if something worthwhile was on the other side, or how far he would have to go to reach it. Could it be the dungeon core? Or perhaps something else? Roland was still hoping to find a link to a higher-rank super dungeon within the island. The monsters here were strong, but at his current level, they wouldn't help him advance as quickly as he wanted. Installing the turrets would provide some initial experience, but once he progressed further, he would be forced to stop. "I might have to go with Plan B." He did have an alternative plan to address his leveling problem, one that didn't rely on this dungeon leading further in. The area already provided a wealth of rare materials. High-level monsters didn't always yield high returns, some didn't drop anything valuable. But the elemental metals and crystals he had gathered could be forged into weaponry fit for knight commanders and beyond. It was enough for the next stage of Albrook's evolution. "Well then, Agni. Woof. Why don't we get some help this time around?" Roland looked at Agni, who was wagging his tail. He had already spent a few days inside this dungeon. Normally, he would take out his entire toolbox and assemble a better drill on the spot to push into the potential new area. He had done it before, grinding to reach Tier 3 and tackling countless challenges alone. But now that he was older and had more allies, handling everything by himself was no longer the best option. There were two paths he could take. He could keep the existence of the potential pathway a secret and claim all the benefits for himself, or he could involve others and speed up the process. The first option would likely yield greater rewards, but it would be far slower than enlisting professional dwarven miners to dig the tunnel for him. Dungeons tended to close in on themselves over time, so reinforcing the walls was essential. Doing it all alone would be tedious, and he had to go back to the institute to perform another lecture soon. "Awoo. So we agree, let's just grab the loot then and go back." After making his decision, Roland turned away from the stubborn wall and headed back into the treasure room. He needed to transport the treasure back to Albrook. The wealth of magical artifacts, combined with the rare materials from the fallen golems, would help fund his next projects. More importantly, the Lord of Fury's core was safely secured in his spatial storage, ready for further research. It likely contained a high-quality program, one that he could potentially implement in his own golems. His constructs were patrolling outside, scanning the vast boss chamber, so he decided to handle the packing himself. Using his spells, he guided weapons, suits of armor, and other valuables into a neat pile before storing them away. However, only one item caught his eye, a large, ornate golden-tinted axe. Elder Gold Two-Handed Axe High Unique High Divine Smite Aura of Golden Glory. An Elder Gold weapon? I'm sure the church would pay handsomely for this one, or should I just keep it? This type of weapon was favored by paladins, but it was useless to regular warriors since it required faith to activate. It boasted 2 powerful enchantments, Divine Smite, one of the most effective spells against unholy beings, and Aura of Golden Glory, which created a zone where necrotic energies couldn't survive while also boosting the strength of nearby allies. While it was useless in the hands of most people, Roland was different. He lifted the axe and, after a few adjustments, channeled his emulated holy mana into its hilt. Almost instantly, an aura of divinity spread through the room. The Elder Gold axe pulsed in waves, illuminating the treasure chamber with a warm, golden glow. Agni's ears perked up, and he let out a curious whine, stepping cautiously into the aura's embrace. As expected, the holy energy bolstered the wolf's vitality, making his fur shimmer faintly. This would be a great weapon against a necromancer, and useful for clearing this dungeon too. He considered what to do with it. If it had been a sword, he would have given it to his brother, Robert, who needed a good weapon for his journey through the dungeon floors. While Roland lacked the faith of priests or paladins, he could design a mechanism using runes to alter someone else's mana, just as he had done for himself. However, without his specialized skills to reduce mana costs, others would likely only be able to use it once or twice before exhausting themselves. The weapon was still made from a material undead monsters were weak against, and the spells were just an icing on the cake. Elder Gold is rarer than Mithril, maybe I'll just keep it for now. With the rare materials he had already gathered, his monetary worries were essentially over. Selling the axe wasn't necessary. It had other uses, some political, others practical. He could always melt it down and experiment with the metal, testing its properties. Perhaps Rastix would even know of some alchemical recipes involving Elder Gold. Soon he placed the axe back into the spatial space and it was time to return. Roland took a moment to survey the treasure room one last time before heading back up the stairs. He had collected a wealth of items, but the nagging feeling of a hidden secret behind the impenetrable wall continued to claw at him. He knew it was something important, but for now, the time for discovery had to be put on hold. He had completed the dungeon dive, and his resources and time were too valuable to waste. Agni followed closely behind, his fur still shimmering faintly with the residual holy energy from the Elder Gold axe. Roland could tell the wolf was feeling stronger, as if the brief exposure to the aura had rejuvenated him. The dungeon had certainly offered its rewards, but it was clear that Roland needed to move forward with his plans for Albrook. With the materials he'd gathered, he could accelerate his progress in improving the defenses and infrastructure of the city. Once at the top, he noticed that the golems had finished salvaging the remaining materials. Their mechanical bodies clanked as they moved, their systems still functional but clearly worn from the intense battle with the Lord of Fury. Once everything was done, he retrieved his golems and let them settle back in his spatial storage with the rest of everything. For a moment, he thought that none of this would have been possible if he hadn't decided to visit the Institute. Before, he had struggled with storage, forced to create bulky golems with enough girth to hold his items. Now, however, he could simply widen the opening with magic, allowing objects that once seemed far too large to fit inside. He turned to Agni and gave the wolf a reassuring pat on the head. "We've got a lot of work ahead, but I think we've earned a break. Let's go back home, boy," Roland said, though his voice carried a trace of uncertainty. There was still so much to do, so many variables to consider, and new obligations constantly arising. The choice to seek help hadn't been entirely his own, he simply didn't have enough time to do everything himself. Perhaps, once he created golems with enough intelligence, he would have other means of handling things. But for now, he had to rely on others. Agni sneezed in response, as if to say he was eager to leave this dark cavern and get back outside. Before departing, Roland took a final look around. He placed various sensors and left a few of his floating golems behind to continue recording data. He needed to determine how long it would take for the boss to respawn, and, if possible, to gauge the true extent of that mysterious wall. "Lord Arthur, a letter has arrived, it's from His Grace." "That's certainly unexpected," Arthur replied with a forced smile as he accepted the letter. The seal of the Valyrian household was unmistakable, an emblem that couldn't be forged and could only be opened through a specific procedure. "I think this is only the second one he's ever sent me." Arthur recalled receiving a similar letter when he was ordered to go to Albrook. At the time, he had assumed he was being cast away, banished to the rural outskirts of their territory, a place so insignificant that he would fade into obscurity, reduced to nothing more than a forgotten mayor. Yet, fate had taken an unexpected turn. His luck had only grown since then, and now, he could even stand in opposition to his brothers, at least to some extent. I never liked this part. Carefully, he withdrew a small, ornate needle from a carved wooden box on his desk. After a brief hesitation, he pricked his finger, allowing a single drop of blood to fall upon the seal. In that instant, the wax shimmered and softened beneath the touch of his heritage, acknowledging him as a Valyrian. Arthur slowly broke the seal and unfolded the parchment, his eyes scanning the carefully scripted words. Mary stood in silence as Arthur read. His fingers tightened around the parchment as he absorbed the contents of his father's letter. The Duke's words, as always, were precise, weighted with the authority of a man who commanded entire legions and shaped the course of noble affairs with the mere stroke of his quill. Is everything all right, Lord Arthur? Mary finally broke the silence. Arthur had remained quiet for a full minute after finishing the letter, his brows furrowing deeper with every line he had read. At last, he placed the parchment down on the desk, lost in thought. She hesitated to interrupt, yet curiosity gnawed at her. Was this good news or bad? Ah, yes, everything is fine, I just wasn't expecting this to happen so early. Mary tilted her head slightly as Arthur spoke, his gaze still fixed on the letter. Though curiosity tugged at her, she knew her place as a maid, unless he chose to share its contents, she had no right to ask. Instead of pressing further, she studied his expression. The usual smirk that often played on his lips had vanished, replaced by something far more serious and contemplative. It seems an opportunity has presented itself. Arthur murmured while tapping the desk with his finger. But I'm not sure we have enough time to gather the necessary forces, this is indeed troubling. Time. Mary replied, wondering what they needed more time for. Yes. We must prepare. He exhaled, then looked up at her, his expression quite serious. Summon the High Knight Commander, I need his counsel. I really need to get that gate in there. This is far too inefficient. Woof. Agni responded as the two made their way through the upper levels of the dungeon, now nearing the exit. Roland moved swiftly through the winding corridors, his thoughts still lingering on the mysterious wall and the hidden mana flow behind it. Though he had decided to retreat for now, he couldn't shake the feeling that something big lay concealed beyond. However, with no immediate way to break through, he had no choice but to bide his time. The dungeon exit was close. Upon reaching it, he slipped into his own tunnel, beginning the journey back to his workshop. The entire trip, between traveling, diving through the dungeon, and returning, had taken a little over 5 days. A time frame he was determined to shorten next time. Unbeknownst to him, his pace quickened, his feet moving faster and faster as his mouth began to water. Days of eating cold rations in the dungeon had only deepened his appreciation for his wife's freshly made meals. He had grown quite attached to them, perhaps a little too much. More than that, he was beginning to realize just how much he missed her and the peace of home whenever he was away. Maybe he really was turning into an old fart. Is there a problem? Just before reaching home, a flashing icon on his helmet's display caught his attention. Arthur was trying to contact him. Though the two had grown closer, the young lord rarely reached out unless it was something important. Roland had planned to report his findings from the dungeon soon and request manpower for an expedition in a week's time. This seemed like the perfect opportunity to bring it up. Arthur. Ah, it finally connected. Roland, my friend. Is there trouble? He asked, opening the entrance to his workshop. His multiple minds were already scanning the area, checking for any nearby enemy forces. Sebastian had mentioned a messenger arriving earlier at Arthur's estate, and Roland wondered if this had something to do with it. Trouble? Not exactly, but it's best discussed in private. It's an important matter that can't wait. I see. Give me a moment, I'll be there in an hour. Splendid. Arthur replied, his tone implying that it was truly something urgent. Roland ended the communication with a sigh. Whatever Arthur had to discuss, it was serious enough that he couldn't afford to delay it. Still, he needed a moment to clean up and at least grab a bite before heading out. Agni, looks like our break is going to be cut short, or at least mine. While his wolf could stay here, he needed to head back into the city. Although he had grown accustomed to being around the soldiers and residents, he still didn't like wandering through the streets where everyone recognized him. His gaze fell on the teleportation chamber and the gate within it. He made a mental note to install a small gate in Arthur's hidden underground training chamber, allowing him to avoid walking through the city as much as possible. Even though it would be a waste of materials and mana, he deemed it worthwhile as Arthur needed an escape route that could teleport him to a safe location if something went wrong. I really have been slacking when it comes to these gates. I need to create a pocketed version. They don't need to be as large as the ones at the Mage Towers. With that in mind, he headed into his workshop. Once there he called up Bernier to let him handle the sorting of items. Bernier arrived promptly, wiping his stained hands on a worn leather apron as he stepped into the largest chamber of the workshop. The half-dwarven craftsman had been hard at work on the latest turret schematics, but Roland's sudden return meant that his priorities had to shift. "Well, boss, I see you made it back in one piece." Bernier grinned, glancing at Roland's armor, and could tell that it had been strained in the dungeon dive. "Judging by the look of you, I take it the dungeon wasn't a walk in the park." Roland exhaled as he began unloading his spatial storage, a veritable treasure trove of magical artifacts, raw materials, and salvaged constructs spilling out onto the reinforced workbenches but also the floor. There was just not enough space to hold everything. The chamber was now lined with weapons, cracked golem cores, and various elemental ores. It was manageable. Roland replied, waving a hand as another set of neatly stacked elemental crystals appeared. "But time-consuming. I've marked a possible hidden passage in the lower levels, though it'll take more manpower to excavate. Maybe you'll want to tackle it. Could use someone I can trust down there." "Me? In that dungeon?" Bernier chuckled sheepishly as he had long since left his dungeon diving days behind. Working as a porter was just something he did to survive, but his true passion lay in crafting. "But, boss, what is all of this?" Bernier let out a low whistle as his eyes landed on the glimmering elder gold axe, its divine aura still faintly pulsing. "By the old gods, you didn't happen to rob a church?" "Ha, no, but just place this in the vault for now. I'll leave these to you. Lord Arthur needs something from me, but it shouldn't take long." "Leave it to me, boss." Bernier eagerly began sorting the items, his eyes gleaming with delight as he examined the dungeon weapons and materials. Roland, on the other hand, prepared to leave. He needed to see what Arthur wanted, but for some reason, he had a feeling it wouldn't be that simple. Roland's workshop doors closed behind him with a resonant thud as he set off for Arthur's estate. The journey was brisk and his mind was already whirring with the implications of Arthur's summons. Clad in his runic armor and cape, he strode through the familiar city streets until he arrived at the vine-draped gates of Arthur's estate, a new feature which apparently the young lord liked. A pair of vigilant guards at the entrance immediately recognized him. One of them stepped forward and offered a crisp salute. Normally, he would have already been surrounded by guards, but he had managed to order them to stop following him constantly as it still annoyed him to no end. "High Knight Commander Wayland, welcome back to the Lord's estate." The guard's voice rang out loud and clear, almost as if he intended to alert everyone of his arrival. Sure enough, a group of soldiers, maids, and a few butlers quickly gathered to escort him inside. Ever since he had received his newly elevated title and with the estate now wealthy enough to hire more staff, he had become quite a prominent figure. As Arthur's right-hand man and the undisputed powerhouse of the operation, he was revered by some and resented by others. At ease. He spoke shortly and strode forward. The staff knew he was a man of few words and wisely kept their interactions brief. As he walked, he took a moment to survey the estate. The villa's expansion was well underway, steadily transforming it into something grander, closer to what a noble's mansion should be. It was even beginning to remind him of his old home. Arthur will probably need to host a few parties to gain allies. Nobles do love their gatherings. I really hope this isn't about that. With their operation expanding and Arthur's influence growing, other nobles were beginning to take notice. While many lesser nobles, barons and knights had already pledged their loyalty to Arthur's siblings, not everyone had been claimed. Some were still waiting for an opportunity to prove themselves to more influential figures. It wouldn't be surprising if their affairs soon took on a more diplomatic nature. Securing new contracts with merchants and craftsmen could also be highly profitable. After all, not everything had to rely on the dungeon's resources. One of Roland's biggest concerns, however, was noble gatherings. Attending such events would require Arthur to leave Albrook, and Roland wasn't entirely confident in the abilities of his two knights. They were still relatively new Tier 3 class holders, which meant the danger was very real. If Arthur's brothers decided to mobilize their forces while he was traveling, Roland feared that the two knights along with Mary, might not be strong enough to protect him alone. That left only one solution: if Arthur began traveling, Roland himself might have to serve as his main bodyguard. It was a role he would rather avoid as he already had enough of his own problems to deal with. One way to alleviate this issue was to establish more teleportation gates, allowing Arthur to travel directly between cities. The problem, however, was that such gates were rare and typically housed within mage towers. Roland had a plan to address this limitation, but it still required someone to travel physically, just not Arthur himself. Something like a golem drone could work, he mused. Lost in thought, he finally arrived at the entrance. His boots echoed against the polished marble floor as he strode through the grand hall of Arthur's estate. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows, casting warm patterns across the floor. The estate buzzed with quiet activity. Servants moved gracefully between rooms, soldiers stood at attention, and attendants exchanged hushed remarks. As soon as the guards recognized him, a chorus of respectful salutations rang out. "High Knight Commander Wayland, welcome back." One of the guards, his voice brimming with pride, shouted the greeting with particular enthusiasm. His eyes gleamed with admiration, something Roland still found difficult to stomach. His goal was to train these men, strengthen them, and eventually step down from his command. More than anything, he longed for a simple life. But with recent events unfolding, that dream felt further away than ever. At this rate, he wouldn't find peace until he reached Tier 4 and had enough power to force it. Roland inclined his head in acknowledgement and moved on. Soon, he entered a quieter wing of the estate, where the formal greetings faded into respectful silence. The corridor led him to a heavy oak door, intricately carved with the Valyrian emblem, Arthur's study. 2 guards were stationed outside, having taken over for Gareth and Morian, who were occupied elsewhere. Mary, the strongest among Arthur's inner circle aside from Roland himself, was undoubtedly inside. Upon seeing him, the guards stepped aside without hesitation. "The Lord is expecting you, High Commander." Taking a steady breath, Roland pushed open the door and stepped inside, already familiar with the room. To his surprise, Arthur wasn't seated behind his desk. Instead, he stood by the window, gazing outside, while Mary quietly prepared tea. He seemed rather consumed with some thoughts and didn't notice he was there until the door was closed. Roland paused in the doorway, his gaze settling on Arthur's reflective profile as he surveyed the barracks in the distance. The soft clink of porcelain accompanied Mary's careful preparation of tea at a side table, a quiet counterpoint to the urgency simmering beneath the surface. "Arthur," Roland began after making sure that all sounds were blocked from getting out. He did not see himself as a follower but as an equal to Arthur. "You wanted to see me?" Arthur slowly turned, the weight of his thoughts evident in the crease of his brow. His eyes indicated that he had not slept for a while. "Yes, Roland my friend, come and sit down, we need to talk about something." Arthur gestured toward a pair of high-backed chairs near the window. As Roland moved to join him, the quiet murmur of the estate outside seemed to fade, replaced by the weight of the moment. He eased himself into one of the chairs, accepting a cup of tea from Mary, who remained silent. A few moments passed before Arthur finally spoke. "Have you ever heard of monster culling?" "Monster culling? Yes, but isn't that due in a few years?" Roland nodded, finding nothing unusual in the question. The culling was a scheduled eradication of monsters whenever their populations grew too large. It took place in various regions of the kingdom, primarily targeting invasive species like goblins, which reproduced at an alarming rate. The process was especially urgent when a goblin king emerged, as such elite monsters posed a serious threat. Dragnus Island, however, was unique. Its culling was tied to a different source, the Super Dungeon. This ancient dungeon had never been fully cleared, and its final boss remained undefeated. Some even speculated that if the dungeon's guardian, the dragon, were ever slain, the entire volcano would collapse. Uncleared dungeons carried a greater risk of dungeon breaks, violent outbursts where monsters spilled out in overwhelming numbers. On Dragnus Island, this occurred like clockwork every 15 years. A wave of creatures would flood down from the volcanic region, forcing a large-scale defensive effort. Roland had been aware of this before coming to the island. In fact, when he arrived, only a year or two had passed since the last culling. By all accounts, there should still have been several years before the next one. Yet, if Arthur was bringing it up now, something must have gone wrong. "My father, the Duke, sent me a letter." "The Duke?" "Yes, my father. Duke Alexander Valerian." Roland noticed Arthur pause for a moment after uttering his father's full title. It was a fleeting hesitation, but it spoke volumes. The young lord's relationship with the Duke seemed troubled and was perhaps not unlike Roland's own strained history with his father, Wentworth Arden. The Duke sent me a letter this morning. A call to arms, to be exact. The culling is coming sooner than anyone anticipated, and we're being forced to participate. It's that bad. This was unexpected news. Normally, the monster surge wouldn't reach as far as Albrook. Only cities closer to the volcanic core of the island were usually affected, with the main city, where the Duke resided, bearing the brunt of the assault. That was where the dungeon's entrance lay, and where the main Valyrian forces, supported by hired adventurers, would make their stand. During these waves, some monsters would inevitably stray from the central conflict, attacking outlying settlements in smaller skirmishes. To counter this, other nobles were tasked with mobilizing their private armies to defend their territories. However, if Albrook itself was being called to arms, it could only mean one thing: this time, the monster surge was far worse than expected. Good, then this will be easier to explain. Arthur's gaze shifted toward his teacup. After taking a slow sip, he continued. You probably don't know this, but the nobles like to play a game during the culling, one that we've been invited to take part in. A game? Roland asked, frowning. He had studied many aspects of noble politics, but this was unfamiliar territory. However, Arthur seemed almost energized by the topic, which was a rare sight. Yes, it's an old Valyrian tradition. Once the culling is over, everyone tallies up the monster cores they've collected. The noble with the most is declared the winner. Oh, so it's a competition between noble armies. Exactly. And like any competition, there's a prize. Roland was beginning to see where this was going, and why Arthur had called him here. So you mean? Yes, my friend. Arthur's eyes gleamed with excitement and perhaps some hope. This is my chance to prove myself to my father. To show him that I am no lesser than my brothers. This is more than a mere contest of monster cores, Roland, it's my chance to prove that I can lead, even when the odds are stacked against me. My father's expectations, my brother's superiority, they've all driven me to this moment. Roland listened without interrupting. There was no need for questions as he had already agreed to help Arthur in his quest to prove himself. Over time, the young lord had grown more ambitious, and this seemed like his first real opportunity to gain momentum. Until now, they had always been on the defensive, reacting to threats rather than taking initiative. But if they could achieve results no one expected, this might be the first true step toward solidifying Arthur's place. I see, and you believe that winning this competition will secure your position among your siblings. Arthur offered a tight, determined smile. Not only will it silence the doubts of others or the council, but it will also show our people that the Valyrian legacy is strong within me. But for that to happen, I need your help. This was a troubling development. Roland was already swamped with work, and this only promised to bring more complications. As High Knight Commander, he would almost certainly be responsible for leading the forces. Delegating to Gareth or Morian wasn't an option, as they were both beneath him in rank. I knew something like this would happen. I need more information. He resisted the urge to sigh and walk away as he had already promised to help the young lord. Arthur's eyes gleamed with expectation, silently pleading for a strategy, something that could lead them to victory. Roland wasn't sure if outright winning was even possible with their current forces. However, victory might not be necessary. If Arthur could match or surpass at least one of his brothers in the monster core collection, it would be enough to put him in the race. First, how much time do we have? A good question. Truthfully, I don't know. My father didn't mention it in his letter. But fear not, as I've already reached out to our allies in both guilds for information, and Mary has dispatched some trusted individuals to investigate. I see, any estimates? It could be anywhere from half a year to a year or more. We should still have some time, but what do you think? Arthur had given him as much information as possible, but the situation was still troubling. If they had to mobilize immediately, they wouldn't be fully prepared. Their forces were growing, and they had managed to equip their soldiers with high-quality enchanted weapons, yet they still lagged behind the other Valyrian brothers in sheer numbers and experience. Then there was the issue of their location. Albrook was on the outskirts, meaning they would likely be tasked with defending the nearby regions. If no monsters reached their borders, they'd be left with nothing to fight, no monster cores to collect, no way to prove themselves. On the other hand, if Albrook remained untouched, the Valyrian generals might order their forces to reinforce more dangerous areas instead. That presented its own risks, as leaving their territory exposed could lead to potential threats sneaking in while they were away. I could use those guys as city guards. If we can mass produce them, that is. Fortunately, Roland had just returned from the dungeon, where he had faced a spear formation of golems. He had already gathered their remains, and once their cores were analyzed, he could use his runes to recreate their fighting power. While golems weren't as intelligent as real soldiers, they didn't require training. Their skill floor was naturally high, and with near Tier 3 durability, they would serve as perfect shields for his forces, ideal for guarding Albrook in their absence. There might be a way. Arthur's eyes lit up after Roland muttered these words. I knew you'd come up with something. Arthur nodded, as if it was only natural for Roland to have some kind of plan. Don't be too excited, this will cost you a lot, and I'm not sure if we'll be able to do everything in just a few months. But, there might be a chance. Haha, well then, what did you have in mind, my friend? I'm all ears. Arthur leaned forward and Roland started talking. He described his encounter in the boss chamber and how he thought he could use the rocks their bodies were composed of to restore them. We'll need the cooperation of the Union, of course, and some miners for that level. This will cost a lot, but I think we should easily earn back the costs with what's down there. This was, of course, all theoretical. There were plenty of rare materials down there, but before anything could be done, they needed to establish a proper supply route. Without one, nothing would work. Roland noticed Arthur twitch at the mention of money. Clearly, the young lord wasn't accustomed to Roland's spending habits. If this project were to succeed, a visit to the local bank for a loan might be inevitable. I see. Well, we'll sort out the price later. Tell me more about that dungeon and your idea. Roland nodded and began recounting his experience, how he had fought through the dungeon, defeated the boss, and uncovered additional resources, along with a mysterious wall that hinted at something hidden beyond. To breach that barrier, they would need to assemble a team of professional miners. Moreover, he proposed constructing a main city teleportation gate, as he was determined to keep outsiders from accessing his underground workshop where his personal gate was housed. Ugh! Roland paused mid-explanation, narrowing his eyes. Is something wrong? And no, I'm fine. Arthur replied, though his face had noticeably paled. Roland sighed. It wasn't hard to figure out why. Everything he was proposing, from assembling a team of professional miners to constructing a pseudo-mage tower to house the main teleportation gate, would cost an enormous amount of gold. Probably more than they currently had. Selling some of the monster drops and rare ores would help, but it wouldn't be enough to cover everything. If they wanted to complete this project before the culling began, they would almost certainly need to take on debt and hope that their investment would work out in the end. Roland observed Arthur closely, already certain of the outcome. Despite the young lord's initial hesitation, he would agree, he had to. In the grand scheme of things, the money they spent now would be insignificant compared to what they stood to gain. Arthur's pale expression, momentarily clouded with doubt, gradually shifted. Determination flickered in his eyes. With a sharp breath, he set his tea down with a loud thud, the porcelain rattling against the saucer, teetering on the verge of cracking. Fine. Let's do it. Roland exhaled, half amused, half relieved. Arthur was a dreamer, after all, one willing to take risks, especially when Roland was the one proposing them. Still, this wasn't just about Arthur's ambitions. It was an opportunity for both of them. Roland needed Arthur's support just as much as Arthur needed his, and perhaps, together, they could rise to new heights neither could reach alone. My lord, your steed is ready. Ah, how time flies. Arthur paused, his gaze settling on Gareth, one of his most trusted knights. Gareth stood patiently, holding the reins of a snow-white horse, Arthur's personal steed. For a moment, Arthur simply stared at its silvery mane, unmoving, as if his legs refused to carry him forward. My lord, perhaps someone else could. No, no, I have to be the one to do this. I need to know the exact numbers. Mary was there as well, accompanied by an entourage of lesser knights and soldiers, all prepared to escort their lord to the city's bank. Established not long ago, the bank had grown rapidly since the discovery of the second dungeon. Now, Arthur was setting out to secure the necessary funds for the expedition, and to strengthen his army. The culling of the monsters could begin at any moment, and they needed money. Let's depart. The soldiers saluted and stood at attention, waiting for Arthur to mount his horse. He glanced around, his expression unreadable, though inwardly, he was still adjusting to this newfound authority. Not long ago, he had commanded almost no one, as his only loyal retainers were the 3 who had accompanied him from the start. Respect had been scarce, given only by those few. But now, things had changed. He could see devotion in the eyes of his soldiers, and in some, even fear. It was a strange, empowering feeling, yet he reminded himself that this was only the beginning. There was still much work to be done if he was to succeed in his ambitions, and perhaps, one day, claim the Duke's title as his own. It's just a temporary loss, we'll make the money back in a few months or perhaps a year. Roland always seems to have a plan, but he is also a gaping void when it comes to spending. While riding through the streets, Arthur's mind remained preoccupied with the weight of his decision. He knew the risk involved in taking such a large loan, but the potential rewards far outweighed the dangers. With the right investments, they could potentially win the upcoming culling competition, but also solidify Albrook as a true stronghold in the region. As they approached the National Bank of Cauldry's branch, Arthur took a moment to appreciate the transformation that had taken place since its creation. While it had never been too modest, the size and outlook had been enhanced to accommodate more customers. The stark white stone structure stood in sharp contrast to the medieval surroundings of Albrook, its pristine facade exuding an air of exclusivity and power. Towering Greek-style columns lined the entrance, each adorned with intricate gold filigree depicting the royal crest and arcane runes of protection. The NBC was more than just a bank, it was a showcase of noble prestige. The moment Arthur reached the main steps, a group of elite guards in immaculate plate armor stepped forward, their spears forming a crossed barrier to prevent entry. Their faces were expressionless, their posture rigid, uncompromising professionals who served the wealthiest and most powerful of the kingdom. Not even Arthur, who was a duke's son, could impose on these people as they served the crown. "Present your identification." Arthur reached into his coat and retrieved his obsidian bank card, embossed with his family crest. The moment he held it up, the guards examined it closely, their eyes flickering with the faint glow of magical detection spells. After a brief pause, they nodded and stepped aside. "Welcome to the National Bank of Cauldry's, Lord Valerian. You may proceed." With a subtle gesture, Arthur signaled his entourage to remain outside. Only Mary followed him in, her ever-watchful eyes scanning the area for any potential threats. The interior of the NBC was a marvel of craftsmanship and magic. The marble floors gleamed under the light of floating crystal chandeliers, their soft glow providing a refined yet efficient illumination. Tall, arched ceilings stretched overhead, enchanted murals depicted moments of great financial history. Standing at key positions throughout the grand hall were multiple massive golems, their dark metallic bodies adorned with golden insignias of the bank. Their eyes, burning with a steady blue glow, tracked every movement within the building. These sentinels were not mere decorations, as they were the final line of defense against any would-be thieves or assailants. Arthur knew that Roland would love to study their enchantments, but any attempts would be seen as a hostile attack. "Lord Valerian, welcome." An elegantly dressed banker greeted them with a low bow. His fine silk robes bore the sigil of the bank, and his demeanor radiated the kind of cool confidence only those accustomed to dealing with nobility possessed. "I am Alastair Grendalm, Senior Financial Overseer. How may we assist you today?" Arthur met the man's gaze and immediately knew this would not be an easy opponent. He had come here not only to borrow money but also to negotiate favorable incentives. These could rise to over 50% if he failed to secure a good deal. Everything depended on his reputation and his ability to sell himself. The man before him was a professional lender, someone who would not part with a single coin unless he was convinced of Arthur's ability to repay. Arthur did have a few assets he could use as collateral, the most significant being his recently expanded luxury mansion. However, the auction house was off-limits, as it belonged to the Valerian family and remained under his father's control. Arthur took a slow breath, steadying himself as he met Alastair Grendalm's cool gaze. The banker's shrewd eyes glimmered with amusement, as if he already anticipated a long and arduous negotiation. "I seek a loan, a substantial one." Alastair arched a brow, his fingers steepled together as he leaned forward slightly. "A bold opening, Lord Valerian. I admire directness. Might I inquire as to the sum?" Arthur glanced at Mary, who gave a barely perceptible nod. His hands shivered slightly as he pulled out a piece of parchment he had marked the amount of gold coins he wished to borrow. The sum was quite high and the man raised an eyebrow before speaking out in an amused yet respectful tone. "Ah, a young noble with ambition. This is quite the sum, my lord. But may I ask what collateral you intend to offer?" "My personal estate in Albrook. Additionally, I have secured a large stake in the dungeon's resources." Once our operations are fully underway, we anticipate substantial returns from rare materials and monster cores. The banker tapped his fingers against the polished oak desk. The dungeon does intrigue me. However, valuing an as yet untapped resource is difficult. He paused, studying Arthur's face for a reaction. When none came, he pressed on. The estate is valuable, but for a loan of this magnitude, we require firmer assurances. Arthur frowned. He had expected resistance, but it was clear that without additional leverage, the bank would either reduce the sum or increase the interest to an unacceptable level. He needed something more compelling. Before he could speak, the man proposed something himself. Alistair leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers still steepled as if weighing Arthur's words with practiced calm. His gaze flicked over to Mary, who was standing further in the back. When dealing with a loan of this size, one must consider all the potential risks. The dungeon's resources may be valuable, but they are not guaranteed. And while your estate in Albrook is well regarded, it alone may not be enough to cover such a large sum, so may I propose something? The man asked, and Arthur nodded to allow him to speak. Even if Arthur was the one trying to get money, his status was still above this man who was nothing more than an employee of a bank. Perhaps, the High Knight Commander himself could offer some assurances. Arthur blinked, confused. Sir Wayland. The banker's smile was small, but it was there. If I may be so bold. Alistair said, leaning forward just a fraction more. Given the High Knight Commander's illustrious reputation, his involvement in this venture would certainly bolster your position. The bank could consider his services as collateral. For a brief moment, the room was silent. Roland wasn't there for Arthur to ask if he was fine with it, but Arthur already knew the answer to that question. His friend had been the one pushing for this small loan of thousands of gold coins and had told him to secure a good deal for them. Legally, Arthur was Roland's superior and could lend out his services to others. He wasn't sure what the bank would ask of him, so he needed to probe for answers. He would not lend himself out if they were planning to have him kill people on their behalf. Could you elaborate? What do you mean by services? Arthur asked, his voice steady. Of course, Lord Valerian. What I mean is, the High Knight Commander's reputation in runesmithing precedes him. Runesmithing? Arthur was a bit confused. He thought they wished to hire him as a mercenary, but this was about Roland's crafting skills. Yes, we are aware of Knight Commander Wayland's skills, we would just require the earnings from his creations to be redistributed towards the loan. I see. This didn't seem as bad as he thought. Roland was still producing runic weapons, armor, and even golems at his workshop. Some were being sold directly at his shop, but others at the Valerian auction house. If that's what you want, I suppose I could agree to a compromise. However, I propose that the bank receives earnings only from the commissions at the auction house, not from Sir Wayland's personal store or projects. Alistair's polite expression did not change, but Arthur could tell the man was reassessing the deal. The auction house was where Roland's highest quality runic equipment was sold to the elite, nobles, knights, and wealthy merchants willing to pay a premium. The bank would certainly earn a hefty sum from those commissions. But Roland's personal store, though profitable, catered to a broader audience at more accessible prices and sold more in bulk. Arthur didn't care much about the revenue he would lose, so he just wished to tie this deal to his own profits. A reasonable adjustment. Alistair admitted, nodding slightly. The auction house does see most of the traffic from affluent buyers. He started tapping the desk again, clearly trying to calculate the potential profits. Normally, they would be unable to get money from the auction house, as it belonged to the Valerian Duke. However, Roland's earnings were tied to Arthur, as he was his personal knight, so they could take those for themselves. If we are to forego direct earnings from the High Knight Commander's private business, I will need to adjust the interest rate to be slightly higher. Arthur resisted the urge to scowl. The bank was not about to let him walk away without squeezing as much out of the deal as they could. He had anticipated this. Luckily, this was still within his acceptable range. If the interest rate was only marginally higher but the loan amount remained intact, it would be worth it. Arthur was willing to even go over the limit as Roland presented him with an earning amount that would easily pay off this sum within a year or two. Adjustments? Are you sure you won't reconsider? Even though everything was within his calculations, that didn't mean he would just agree to it outright. If he could shave off even a fraction of a percentage from the loan, he would. Soon, the two men were engaged in an animated conversation about the city's earning potential and how easily Arthur would be able to pay off the loan. He knew that as long as the bank was assured they would get their money back, they would gladly work with them. Mary stood in the corner without moving, her gaze fixed on the golems that posed a potential threat to her lord. Time passed, and after about half an hour, the two men seemed to reach an agreement. Eventually, Alistair snapped his fingers, and one of the other employees carried over a parchment with a prepared contract. "Please, look through it, Lord Valerian." Arthur nodded, surprised by the swift arrival of the document. It meant that someone had been listening to their conversation and preparing it as they spoke. He took his time reading through it, which took another half an hour. After ensuring that there were no hidden pitfalls within the contract, Arthur exhaled softly and reached for the quill offered by Alistair. With a smooth, practiced motion, he signed his name at the bottom of the parchment and completed it with a Valerian stamp, sealing the agreement. "Excellent," Alistair said with a pleased nod, rolling up the parchment and affixing the bank's official seal upon it. "The funds will be transferred to your designated accounts within the next 3 days. Should you require any further financial assistance, the National Bank of Caldres is always at your service. I appreciate your cooperation, Overseer Grendalm. I trust this will be a mutually beneficial arrangement. That is always our intent, Lord Valerian. May fortune favor your endeavors." With that, Arthur rose to his feet, signaling Mary to follow. The weight of the deal settled on his shoulders, but rather than burden him, it only strengthened his resolve. He had secured the funds, and now, he would ensure they were used wisely. As he stepped out of the grand banking hall, the afternoon sun cast its golden glow upon the polished stone steps. His escort was waiting, their disciplined ranks standing at attention. Gareth, his ever-loyal knight, held the reins of his steed, ready for departure. After mounting his horse, Arthur considered giving an order to inform Roland about the deal but quickly decided it was unnecessary. In the distance, his gaze caught one of the golemic turrets, its eye fixed in their direction, and he knew his friend was likely aware of his every move. He still wasn't sure how he felt about this level of oversight from his ally, but at the moment, he had little choice. Turning away from the monitoring device, he signaled his men to escort him back to the estate. Once the money arrived, he would have to sign a mountain of paperwork to put it to use. Not a single coin would go to waste, his future depended on it. "Arthur seems to be keeping his part of the bargain, now it's up to me to do the rest." Roland sat in his workshop, looking at the larger display screen as Arthur and his men returned from the bank. He knew that he didn't have to worry about getting the funds, but he was still interested in the bank along with the golems within, along with the cards they had. While normally Arthur would just be able to use the card, the sum they needed was much bigger than a few handful of gold coins. They needed enough to finance the dungeon project along with many buildings in the ever-expanding city. One problem Roland had with the bank was his inability to peek inside. Both the bank and the church denied him access to their establishments. All of his turrets and cameras were positioned outside, but they refused to allow any inside. They also rejected the installation of runic appliances, which were spreading through the city like wildfire. Many people were already enjoying hot baths and refrigerators, but the bank knew better than to allow foreign runic equipment within its walls. "I still have no idea how to access those cards, and getting one for myself isn't possible." Although he wasn't a noble, he technically met the minimum requirements to obtain one of those elusive black cards. The problem was that acquiring one would require him to fully expose his status. There was no way around it, and that was the main reason he chose to avoid it. Asking Arthur to let him examine his card was an option, but if something went wrong, he had no idea how the bank would react. He had heard stories of mages and runesmiths attempting to crack the cards, none of those stories ended well. "I'll have to give up on that notion, but I wonder if my debugging skill will work on it or not, it has not been able to evolve." Debugger L9. Passive skill. Allows the user to find and resolve defects. Bonus to intelligence +5. This skill of his that had dictated much of his life had reached its limit and had not leveled up in a while. He was not sure if it ever would, as it was something he took from his old life. "Well, I have other things to worry about." He eventually turned off the screen and stood up from his chair. It was time to establish his metal farm within the dungeon and see what was behind that wall. "What do you mean the dungeon is closed? There should have been a notice at the guild. Have you not heard?" "No, I haven't heard anything about this." "Now step aside. I'm not listening to your made-up bullshit, I know what you're trying to do. But I wasn't born yesterday." Shouting erupted at the entrance to the deeper dungeon, a name that had recently come into use. A party of 5 adventurers was arguing with the guards stationed there, unable to enter for reasons unknown. Their leader was shouting loudly at one of the guards, thinking the soldiers were trying to get money from them. "Sir, please step back. If you attempt to force your way in, we will report you to the guild." "Ha! I'd love to see you try. Do you even know who we are?" The guards raised their shields and leveled their spears, but they knew the truth: if the adventurers charged, they wouldn't stand a chance. They were merely Tier 2 class holders, while this was a platinum-ranked party that had been delving into the dungeon for months. Tension crackled in the air as the adventurers stood their ground, eyes burning with frustration. "We've paid our dues. We've been diving into this dungeon since it was discovered, and now you tell us it's closed? On whose authority?" "Under my authority." A voice boomed from the distance before this could get out of hand. The loud adventurers felt their knees buckling under pressure as a strange aura washed over them. The soldiers they were shouting at didn't seem affected by it. The adventurers turned sharply towards the source of the voice, their expressions shifting from anger to caution. A figure approached with measured steps, clad in dark runic armor. "We greet the High Knight Commander." The soldiers snapped to attention as they instantly recognized the man's magical armor. Beside him stood a massive wolf, its mane flickering with flames as it yawned, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. Behind them, a large group of dwarves, along with other adventurers, slowly emerged, all making their way toward the entrance of the deep dungeon. "Wait, is that?" one of the adventurers muttered under his breath, recognizing the man instantly. Wayland, High Knight Commander, a name spoken in both reverence and fear among those who operated in the city of Albrook. His reputation preceded him, not just as a man of title but as one who commanded respect through sheer presence and power. Everyone knew of his unparalleled battle strength, and even a platinum-ranked adventurer was no match for him. The adventurers tensed, their bravado faltering in the presence of the infamous High Knight Commander. The leader of the group clamped his mouth shut, unwilling to utter another word as the pressure in the chamber grew heavier. "Who's making all that fuss? Is that the guy? Want me to shut him up, Wayland?" From behind the armored knight commander, a man stepped forward. He was tall and muscular, wearing a strange harness that left his chest exposed. However, before he could act, Wayland raised a hand, silently ordering him to stand down. The man clicked his tongue, shook his head, and retreated without another word. "Just be quiet, you big oaf, and stop making trouble." A woman with longer ears and wearing a bow shouted at the muscular man before he settled down. Silence settled over the chamber as more figures emerged from a nearby tunnel. A large group of dwarves, clad in mining gear, stepped forward. While no heavy machinery was visible, spatial bags carried by hired porters hinted at the equipment hidden within. Among them were soldiers, adventurers, and several strange floating golems, dodecahedron-shaped constructs with orbs for eyes that hovered eerily in the air. "What was that?" After the last of them had disappeared into the dungeon, one of the adventurers finally spoke. "It was a warning, let's take a break and check that guild notice." The leader kicked a loose rock in frustration and then turned away. He knew better than to meddle in noble affairs, and whatever was happening in the dungeon, it was best to steer clear, for now. If they insisted on entering, they'd be risking more than just failure. Weren't those the same adventurers? Roland led the expedition, Agni walking beside him, deep in thought. The group they had just encountered was the same one he had tricked when setting up the illusion device on the dungeon's lowest floor. It seemed they had returned, possibly equipped with tools to detect illusory magic this time. "I guess I got lucky. Best if no rumors about the lowest floor spread before we're finished with it." It had been around 2 weeks since his battle with the dungeon boss at the lower level of the dungeon. After a short period of recovery and preparation, he had finally put together a team to begin full-scale operations. Now, with the funding secured through Arthur, he could take the next step toward unlocking the dungeon's hidden potential. Armand had come along for the ride, and Lobelia was also present. Neither of them was close to reaching level 200, the threshold for the final level, but that didn't matter. With all their combined manpower, the monsters in these levels wouldn't be able to stop them, especially with him and Agni generating enough radiant aura to weaken the undead. Roland had hoped to bring his brother along to help him gain experience, but Robert had yet to reach his first Tier 3 class. However, he was close. Once he finished assembling the teleportation gate, Roland expected Robert to complete his first advancement. Roland wondered what kind of class his brother would unlock. Since Robert didn't possess any spirit or aura warrior classes, Roland suspected he might gain a champion variant focused on swordsmanship. He wished he could have done this sooner, but gathering all the necessary craftsmen and materials had proven challenging. They had to negotiate a new agreement with the Union dwarves regarding the distribution of wealth in the lower dungeon region. Certain mineral pockets were present there, and the boss chamber contained large quantities of obsidian rock, a potent material for golem creation. To Roland's annoyance, their progress was slow. With so many people on this journey and the dungeon's tight corridors, moving downward was a tedious process. The dwarves, with their shorter legs and lack of adventuring experience, frequently insisted on taking breaks, and drinking alcohol along the way, making the descent even slower. It took them several days to reach the bottom, forcing them to set up camp along the way. "I'm glad this is the first and last time we're doing it like this." Roland exhaled as they finally reached the lower depths of the dungeon. The only thought that kept him going was that once he assembled the teleportation gate, he would be able to go home. His illusory barrier was still intact, confusing the party as they arrived. "Is this a dead end? Did our great leader take a wrong turn?" Armand wasn't afraid to mock him, much to the disappointment of the soldiers, who by now held Roland in high regard. The dwarves, however, burst into laughter, though their amusement quickly faded when Roland waved his hand, revealing a path forward. "No, we're in the right place, just try not to get yourselves killed. The monsters down there are close to level 200. He's not you, blockhead." Lobelia was quick to tease Armand for being wrong again, and soon the group continued to the level with the 5 elemental temples. Since his last visit, all the monsters had respawned, complicating things to some extent. "This place is something else. Is that tower, or is it some type of temple, on fire?" Lobelia asked, gazing into the distance from the entrance they had just stepped through. The rest of the group quickly stopped to take in the vast chamber and the 5 towering structures. As expected, they had all been fully restored and would need to be cleared again before the group could advance, which was exactly why they were here. "Don't wander off. It's too dangerous for you two to go in there alone. Stick to the plan and don't waste any more time." "Okay, big boss." The half-elven girl replied in a playful tone, stretching her arms above her head. The plan was straightforward: reach this level, excavate a large enough chamber to the side, and build a reinforced metallic cage around it. Once that was in place, they would assemble the pre-prepared teleportation gate and link it to Sebastian. Once the gate was active, more people and materials could be transported in, allowing them to clear the temples and set up automated runic turrets to handle the monsters for them. For the final phase of the plan, they would re-clear the boss chamber, something Roland would likely handle alone. Once the boss was defeated, he would lead a group of dwarven miners through the tunnel leading to the treasure chamber and have them break through the wall. His golems had spent considerable time gathering measurements, so he now had precise data on how quickly the boss would respawn. This would allow him to remove the miners before any trouble arose. "But we could always use one of the oldest tricks in the book to stop the boss from respawning in the first place, so it should be fine." There was a well-known method to prevent the boss chamber from resetting, blocking the doors from closing. If left unattended for too long, the doors would automatically shut, and the boss would respawn, even if people were still inside. However, past experiments had proven that keeping the doors open prevented the monster from reappearing. No one knew exactly why, but the leading theory was that the dungeon didn't want its boss monster wandering freely or escaping through the entrance. "Everyone listen up, stay close, and do not wander." Before long, they resumed their journey, and Roland led the group to the temporary chamber he had created during his last visit. It still needed further excavation, which was why he had brought the miners along. As soon as they arrived, the dwarves wasted no time. Pickaxes struck stone with practiced precision while others began unpacking supplies. Before long metallic tubes and other components for the automatic golem turrets came into view. Roland observed as the dwarves worked with remarkable efficiency, their movements honed by years of craftsmanship. The rhythmic clang of pickaxes echoed through the chamber like a song of progress, each swing carving away at the stone to expand the space that would soon serve as the heart of their operations. Nearby, golems assisted in clearing debris. These weren't his own creations but ones provided by the Union, transported here via their spatial technology. For once, he didn't have to get his hands dirty. Instead, his main role was ensuring the safety of the workers, along with his soldiers, as the noise inevitably attracted wandering undead. "Agni, take care of them." "Awoo." His command was barely necessary. Agni was more than capable of handling the undead, and with Armand, Lobelia, and a handful of other platinum-ranked adventurers providing backup, there was little reason for concern. Roland himself was more of a trump card, only to be used if something unexpected happened. So far, though, everything was proceeding smoothly. Maybe I should sketch some new schematics to pass the time. Roland sighed, settling into a chair provided by his soldiers. He briefly considered tackling one of the temples alone, but the thought of leaving the workers unattended made him hesitate. If something went wrong in his absence, he'd regret it. For now, he had no choice but to remain here, stuck in place with little to do except plan for the future. A lone man stared at the chipped steel blade in his hands, then at the undead monster before him. The skeleton had lost both its legs and arms, reduced to nothing more than a torso and a head. Even so, it remained tightly bound in a metallic harness, unable to move. Gripping the blade with both hands, he raised it high and brought it down, striking the monster's sternum dead center, just as he had done dozens of times before. Each swing sent more fragments of metal breaking off his worn weapon, yet the undead's body remained unscathed. He struck again and again, his blows relentless, until finally, the world system's voice echoed in his mind, signaling that he was done. Congratulations, swordsmanship has gained a level. I did it, and this fast. The man stepped away from the monster, his blade now too damaged to be of any further use. It was dull, chipped, and barely holding together. But that was expected, this weapon had been made to be destroyed and discarded. This place was nothing more than a training ground, one he had been granted access to weeks ago. He had spent that time training relentlessly, preparing for his next ascension ritual. That just leaves one more. His training wasn't over yet. There was still one more skill he needed to refine before he could be satisfied. After ignoring the thrashing remains of the defeated monster, he turned his attention to another skeleton nearby. Like the first, this one had been stripped of its limbs, except for a single arm, which ended at the wrist, devoid of fingers. Though locked in place, it could still move what remained of its limb. From the side, he grabbed a massive shield, a thick slab of metal fitted with sturdy straps. With steady steps, he approached the creature, watching as it grew agitated the moment he drew near. The skeleton let out a hollow screech, its one remaining arm flailing in the air. The man didn't flinch. His grip on the shield tightened, and with a single swift motion, he slammed the heavy metal into the monster's remaining arm, sending a loud crack echoing through the chamber. The skeleton's rattling grew louder as it attempted to strike him with its severed limb. The man didn't move as he rooted his legs firmly in place, bracing himself to take the monster's attack head-on. Despite being bound and lacking claws, the skeleton's strength still pushed him back, even though he held the shield firmly with both hands. His muscles strained as he fought to resist the immense force the monster could exert. After a few heavy blows, however, he was forced to retreat. His hands throbbed with pain, but he knew this was the only way to level up this skill, letting the monster relentlessly strike the shield while he held it in place. His brows furrowed, but he quickly went back to it and his skill training continued. The man's arms were beginning to burn with each impact. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but his focus never wavered. This was the final trial, the one that would push him to the next step. The monster's relentless attacks, though painful, were becoming predictable. It was the last bit of refinement he needed for his shield proficiency. Each strike that came crashing down on the shield became a rhythm he could almost anticipate. The bones rattled with every hit, and the air was filled with the sound of metal on metal. His shield, a behemoth of steel, absorbed each blow but soon became nothing but bent metal. Just like with the cheap blades, he needed to replace it with others like it to continue this training, and finally, after several hours and recovery potions, he heard it. Congratulations, shield proficiency has gained a level. The man nodded and took a step away from the monster. His hands were bruised, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He wiped the sweat from his brow, looking at the shattered shield and the pile of broken blades scattered around the chamber. Despite the exhaustion settling into his bones, a satisfied grin tugged at the corner of his lips. He had done it. He had completed the last of his preparations. With this, I can also reach that level. Name: Robert Arden, L150. Classes: T2 Noble Blade L50, T2 Sword Knight L50, T2 Squire L25, T1 Warrior L25. I'm not going to be a burden to anyone anymore. Robert glanced at his status screen for a moment before stepping out of the training chamber. He had reached the max level some time ago, but he had taken his brother's advice to heart. He spent many days here, pushing himself to perfect his skills. All the sword techniques and shield masteries he could learn were now maxed out. Now, he was finally ready to take the next step, to reach the fabled Tier 3 class he had dreamed of his entire life. Confirmed identity, codename Durandal. Please present your identity card. I'll never get used to this. What did he call it? Two-factor authentication. Robert leaned back after pressing his hand against the flat glass surface. As always, it lit up, and a second later, a soft beep confirmed the scan. The process wasn't over yet, he still had to slide a special card halfway into the side slot. Without it, he wouldn't be able to open the chamber or even enter the workshop unless his brother was present. He claimed this thing could also detect if someone was under a spell's influence. The chamber door slid aside, revealing a smooth tunnel. Thick metallic conduits lined the walls, pulsating with runes and flowing magical energy. The sight still felt surreal to him as he was still adjusting to his new life in Albrook. His new identity placed him under his younger brother's direct command. Years ago, that would have been unthinkable, an unbearable humiliation. To serve beneath the very brother he once despised? But now, after everything, it no longer mattered. He owed his life to him. And the truth was undeniable, Roland was the most talented of the 4 siblings. Not even the 2 older ones could compare. It is a shame really, if he cared enough he could surely become the next Baron Arden. Father would probably forgive him if he explained everything. Robert walked forward slowly, lost in thought. He couldn't help but feel that Roland's talents could be put to better use elsewhere. His strength and ingenuity were undeniable, and gaining support from the crown wouldn't be difficult. With his runic creations, the Arden estate would grow stronger, and with their father, a marshal in the army backing them, their family might even rise to the rank of Viscount or higher. But I suppose, it's not too bad here. His gaze shifted forward as he stepped into another chamber, this one packed with even more runic contraptions he didn't understand. At one of the workbenches sat someone dear to his heart, Lucille, or Cortana, as she was called now. Both of them had cast aside their last names to become part of Roland's operation, a choice Robert still believed was far better than what would have happened if Roland hadn't saved him. Oh? Are you finished with your training? Lucille's azure locks bounced as she turned toward him, her voice light with curiosity. Even now, Robert was struck by her beauty, but even that paled in comparison to her intellect. Since arriving here, she had thrown herself into her work, determined to catch up to Roland, an almost impossible feat, in his opinion. He noticed the faint shadows under her eyes and, as always, felt a hint of concern. She was pushing herself too hard again. And, as always, he would try to convince her to rest. Robert approached Lucille with a small frown, crossing his arms as he leaned against the workbench. You've been at this all night, haven't you? Lucille sighed but didn't look up from the glowing runes she was studying on a small metallic plate. She was now a rune mage, specializing in rune magic control. While she couldn't inscribe runes onto metal herself, her ability to manipulate them far surpassed that of an ordinary runesmith. Robert's understanding of runes was minimal at best. Even though he had acquired the rune vassal title and the rune mastery skill along with it, his knowledge remained rudimentary. The passive skill merely allowed him to channel mana through runic structures more efficiently. While it slightly improved his natural affinity with runes, it did nothing to help him alter or customize spells in any meaningful way. Don't start with that, Robert. I'm nearly done fine-tuning this golem rune, it's so fascinating. Did you know that if I change this little component here, I'll be able to increase the mana flow by 0,13%? Ah, sure. Robert exhaled, shaking his head as Lucille became absorbed in her work again. She was brilliant, no doubt, but he wondered if she even realized how much she neglected herself in the process. He supposed it was a trait that she and Roland shared, a relentless pursuit of their goals, no matter the cost. Perhaps this was something that came with being a rune maniac. I'll leave you to it, then. Robert said, standing straight again. I just wanted to let you know, I've finished my training. That got Lucille's attention. She finally looked up, her piercing eyes widening slightly in recognition of his words. You mean? Robert nodded. Yeah. I'm ready for my advancement. Lucille's face lit up with a mix of excitement and she finally put the runic plate away. That's wonderful. You've really put in the work, Robert. Have you decided what class you're going for? He didn't deny it as the past few weeks had been hellish, to say the least. First, he was sent into the dungeon to grind levels, forced to hurl strange bombs at monsters that could kill him with a single swipe of their bony fingers. That was the easy part. What came next was far worse, Roland's grueling regimen to level his most important skills. Robert spent countless hours and days chugging mana potions until he was on the verge of puking, all to accelerate his rune mastery skill. Fortunately, striking restrained skeletal monsters with runic weapons helped him level it quickly. His mana pool had also expanded thanks to a few skill books his brother had given him, but even with that advantage, he still relied heavily on potions provided by Rastix. They worked, but the side effects were brutal. The toxicity buildup left him vomiting some nights and unable to sleep properly. It depends on what I'm able to choose. Robert wasn't expecting anything too exceptional. His current class, Noble Blade, specialized in swordsmanship, but he wasn't sure if he could advance beyond Sword Champion. Truth be told, he had no idea what Tier 3 classes were even available. That knowledge was usually kept secret, and with his father absent, there was no one he could ask for guidance. I'm sure you'll get a lovely skill, you should look through the notes Sir Roland provided. I already did. Before Robert left for the dungeon expedition, Roland had given him a stack of papers detailing possible class choices. His brother had gathered an impressive collection of books on class progression, some acquired during his travels, others sourced from the Magical Institute. The documents outlined the best options for someone like Robert, but they also came with a clear warning: don't aim too high. He was well aware of the Tier 3 stopgap. If he set his sights on an advanced class beyond his reach, he could end up stuck without a class for a long time, unable to progress. It was a risk he couldn't afford to take. But I won't know until I get there. He glanced to the side, where a misplaced dresser with shelves stood. Inside were numerous Ascension ritual crystals. Roland had told him to use them and not to be afraid of abandoning the Ascension ritual if he thought the class he chose was a poor fit. It was a decision that would shape his entire life. It was better to take the time restriction penalty than to be stuck with a weak Tier 3 class. My brother sure likes to over-prepare, doesn't he? I think that's a fine trait. You can never be too prepared. Lucille responded as Robert took a crystal from one of the shelves. For nobles like them, seeing this many wasn't too surprising, but they still cost a fortune. Does he think I'll need this many just to progress? Don't be silly. You're not the only one who needs to undergo Ascension rituals. He probably prepared them for the children as well. I think some of them are coming of age soon. She replied with a smile, but her mouth twitched the moment she heard his reply. I think there's someone else who should take her training more seriously instead of spending all day in the workshop, or with drunken dwarves. I'm just focusing on my skills for now. Lucille avoided Robert's gaze. He knew she hadn't been making use of all the available facilities. She could train her magical abilities against skeletal monsters, just as he honed his physical ones. Using runic equipment on them would also speed up her runic skill progression, yet she preferred studying books and visiting dwarven craftsmen instead. She was falling behind in levels, but Robert had promised himself that once he reached Tier 3, he would personally take her into the dungeon and help her reach level 150 so she could advance as well. Despite her exhaustion, Lucille looked content with her current situation. It seemed that escaping here had been the right decision, as she was finally able to focus on what she loved most, her runes. In a way, Robert felt a hint of jealousy. Unlike him, Lucille was truly enjoying her time here. He knew how much she loved runes and magic. Working under a master like his brother was probably a dream come true for her. Even in the past, she would constantly talk about how fascinating the magical language of runes was, claiming it far surpassed conventional magic. Now, she finally had the opportunity to prove it by assisting Roland, someone who seemed capable of elevating the craft to an entirely new level. But what about him? Did he have any such dreams? In the past, he just wished to become a knight just like his father. He wanted to prove himself worthy of the Arden name, to live up to the expectations placed upon him as a noble. But now, things had changed. His father was no longer his goal, and the weight of nobility no longer shackled him. He was free to carve his own path. Yet, a lingering question remained: what was his path? He exhaled, gripping the Ascension crystal tightly. Whatever it was, he would find it after he achieved Tier 3. This was the last step before he truly became his own person. All right, no more hesitating. He turned to Lucille. I'll start the ritual now. She gave him an encouraging nod, her earlier teasing gone. However, before he could continue with the activation, another being entered the room. Robert turned toward the source of the disturbance. Sebastian, no longer a mere ball of floating light, he now possessed a physical form, a rather sleek, white humanoid frame that moved with eerie grace. His body was smooth, almost porcelain-like, with subtle lines tracing his joints and torso, indicating the intricate mechanisms beneath. His limbs were long and rather lanky. He was no crude iron golem but something far more refined, a construct shaped by careful craftsmanship and cutting-edge rune engineering. But it was his face that stood out the most. Unlike the featureless visages of ordinary golems, Sebastian's face bore an unsettlingly human-like quality. His eyes, if they could be called that, were two faintly glowing slits, radiating a soft azure light that pulsed gently as he moved. The contours of his face were smooth, almost sculpted, yet devoid of unnecessary detail. There was a simple mouth, a nose, and eyebrows, all elements that contributed to a human expression. Yet at this moment, none of them seemed to be functioning. "Ah, Sebastian, how do you like your new body? I haven't finished working on this expression module yet, so you'll have to wait a bit more." Lucille clapped her hands together, her earlier exhaustion momentarily forgotten. She quickly moved closer, eyes gleaming with excitement as she circled around the golem, inspecting every detail of his newly constructed body. "I do not understand your query, Lady Cortana," replied Sebastian, his voice a lot less robotic than before but his lips not moving as he spoke. To an artificial spirit, who was something similar to an artificial intelligence machine, the notion of liking something was difficult to grasp. Yet, despite his monotone response, there was something undeniably impressive about how fluidly he moved. He turned his head toward Robert, tilting it slightly, almost mimicking human curiosity. "So this is what you have been working on all this time?" "Indeed," Lucille responded, unable to contain her enthusiasm. "Roland helped me design the outer shell and construct the runes, but it was me and the dwarves at the main forge that constructed his new body." Robert didn't know what to think of this. Golems usually lacked facial features and were used either for construction or warfare. This one here looked strange and somewhat uncanny. However, this was one of Lucille's projects that she was proud of, so he wouldn't mention it. "If this succeeds, we are planning to put more models into the city to help the residents with work." "I see." You don't look too impressed." Robert crossed his arms, glancing at the humanoid construct with mild skepticism. "I suppose I just don't see the point of making them so human-like. Can those small hands even hold a sword or a mace?" Lucille huffed, hands on her hips. "Not all golems have to be used for combat. There are many other ways they can help us." This was the moment Robert realized that he should have probably not opened his mouth as Lucille started going on quite the monologue. Rune engineering is advancing beyond just war and manual labor. Imagine a city where constructs like Sebastian assist with daily life, guiding visitors, assisting merchants, and even aiding in healing wards. With the right modifications, golems could become more than just servants, they could be companions, protectors, symbols of progress. Robert struggled to find the right words as Lucille's enthusiasm burned brightly in her eyes. He had no doubt that she believed in what she was saying, but the idea of constructs taking on such a role felt strange. The world he grew up in had always been centered around noble duties, honor, and strength in battle. But then again, hadn't his whole world already been turned upside down? Perhaps this was just another part of the changes he had to accept. Sebastian, for his part, remained eerily still, only the soft sound of his internal runes betraying the life within his frame. "Well, I should probably start my ascension trial now." Lucille chuckles while covering her mouth. She realized that Robert had found himself unable to respond to her runic babble. "Hehe, I got carried away a bit. How about you take a seat here and I'll watch over you until you return?" Robert nodded and settled into a chair next to Lucille. The crystal was in his hand, he just needed to activate it, but he was still hesitating. He stared at it for a moment before feeling a small hand rest on his shoulder. Turning to her, he found she said nothing, merely offering a smile. He nodded in return and finally activated the crystal, which would transport him to the Ascension Ritual area, one he had already visited 4 times before. The world stood still as he felt being pulled somewhere. When he opened his eyes he was back at the place that had started it all. Robert stood still for a moment, blinking as the familiar surroundings of the Arden Estates training area materialized before his eyes. It was the same old place, the stone floor, the high ceiling, and the faint scent of sweat and iron that clung to the air. The echoes of his past reverberated here where he faced goblins while desperately trying to prove his worth as an Arden. It was a place where he had spent countless hours pushing his limits, fighting against monsters, and refining his swordsmanship, all in the hopes of gaining strength and respect. He had fought here as a young man, eager to prove himself. Somehow, this place had become his ritual for ascension, where he would be brought whenever he sought to attain his next class. As before, the process remained unchanged. There were several doors leading out of the chamber, each one offering a potential new class. The only clue as to which class he might receive was a symbol above each door, accompanied by a weapon and some armor placed beside it. This time was no different except for one thing. To his surprise, one of the doors seemed a bit more unique than the others. In a dimly lit training chamber, a lone man stood. Around him stretched a shadowed space, encircled by multiple doors, each leading to a different path that would shape his destiny. Above each door hung a unique symbol, often depicting a weapon, a piece of armor, or sometimes a shield. The doors themselves varied as well. Some were made of wood, others of hardened steel, and a few gleamed with polished gold. The right path is usually obvious, but this time, Robert had circled the training chamber, inspecting the doors that led to new classes. Ascension spaces were said to take the shape of places deeply ingrained in a person's soul, and for him, it was this very underground training hall where he had spent years of his youth. The first time he was here, only a single door had stood before him. His initial ascension ritual had offered no trials, he had simply been granted the warrior class. It was a basic path, common and unremarkable, yet it had shaped the course of his life. Not long after, he had chosen to advance as a knight, stepping through the door that led to the path of a squire. That time, he had faced a grueling trial, battling a series of monsters while clad in progressively heavier armor. Even so, he had prevailed on his first attempt. Soon after, he continued his training at the Knight Academy. He took his time, honing his skills to their peak, but his focus remained on mastering the blade. To ascend as a sword knight, he was given a new trial. This time, he had to defeat multiple armored knights in a jousting tournament. These trials felt real, almost indistinguishable from reality, and even featured actual people, some bearing striking resemblances to those he had encountered in his life. For some reason, his final opponent in the tournament had looked eerily similar to one of the young men who had tormented him during his time at the academy. Even now, he could still vividly recall the satisfaction of beating him bloody. At that point, he had reached a new milestone, becoming a Tier 2 class holder, an achievement he took great pride in. Around this time, he reunited with his brother, and after their encounter, he promised to catch up. Determined, he set out toward the border, battling the kingdom's enemies while also being utilized by the army to cull some of the monster tribes in the north. Eventually, he attained his next class, one far rarer than the others, the Noble Blade, a specialization focused on mastering the sword while donning heavy armor. During his ascension trial, he was once again forced to face numerous enemies, all while wielding a sword of lower quality than his multiple opponents. The class focused more on reinforcing his strikes and honing in on his opponent's weak points rather than relying on brute force. This was also the first time he had failed an ascension trial, requiring 2 attempts to overcome it. Something that he was ashamed of, as his elder brothers didn't seem to have failed even once until their Tier 3 ascension attempts. Upon reaching level 100, his progress slowed to a snail's pace. Yet, his unwavering determination to prove himself to his father and make his mother proud kept him going. He threw himself into battle time and time again, fighting fiercely and carving through countless foes in the name of the Arden family. But no matter how hard he pushed himself, he felt like he was chasing a ghost. The more he struggled, the more it seemed as if he was falling behind. All the strength he had gained paled in comparison to his father and many of the other powerful knights he encountered. The absence of any aura skills was undeniable, and deep down, he knew the truth: he would never be able to catch up to those who had been more blessed. Robert exhaled deeply, his gaze sweeping over the array of doors before him. Some looked familiar, doors of steel and gold with weapons and armor set beside them, signifying the paths of warriors and knights. Others were more refined, representing noble combatants, sword masters, and defensive guardians. Each door was a path, a possible future, a decision that could shape his fate. But then there were the strange doors, the ones that defied expectation. Unlike the others, these doors shimmered faintly with an ethereal glow. Ancient runic symbols were etched into their surfaces, pulsating with arcane power. Weapons and armor beside these doors were adorned with intricate engravings, imbued with magic beyond the scope of simple craftsmanship. They looked like something his younger brother would craft. Could this be because of that title? Recently, he had obtained the Rune Vassal title along with the Rune Mastery skill. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it, as it merely allowed him to use runic equipment more efficiently. However, now, faced with multiple rune-inscribed doors, he had to conclude that this ability was the key. Just like before, some doors appeared superior to others. Some were made of ordinary steel, while others gleamed with polished mithril and enhanced weaponry. Robert approached the shimmering runic doors, his fingers tracing the glowing symbols. Unlike the others, these doors pulsed with latent energy, as if aware of his presence. The weapons beside them were different from what he was used to. They weren't simple swords or shields but intricate constructs infused with runic magic. One bore a long sword lined with glowing blue veins, its edge humming softly, while another displayed a suit of armor with strange magic crystals. Now this is a problem. I didn't expect to have this many choices. After circling the area a few times, he identified several potential paths forward. The first was a massive mithril door, behind which lay a sword and an armor set suited for something akin to a sword champion class. This was more or less what he had expected to receive, at least, until he considered the other options. One of the other doors held a similar setup, but the armor and sword were covered in intricate runes, suggesting a class like rune champion. Given that he was now working under his brother, a powerful runesmith, so this might have been the better choice. He lacked aura skills, meaning the prestigious aura-based classes were beyond his reach. However, he had seen firsthand what his brother could achieve with runic armor. What if he could do the same? This was likely his only chance to catch up to those monsters, a new path forward. What about this one? Why does it lack any weapons or armor? Robert had nearly decided on the door leading to the potential rune champion class when he suddenly hesitated before a different path. Like the others, this door was crafted from gleaming mithril, but the runic glow emanating from it was even stronger. However, unlike the others, it displayed no weapons or armor, leaving him uncertain about what lay beyond. Normally, he would equip his gear before entering a trial, making this anomaly all the more confusing. It was the only door of its kind in the chamber, yet the sheer intensity of its magical energy far surpassed that of the rune champion door. That alone made him pause. Should I just try it? If it's bad, I'll just fail the trial and try again. Roland had advised him to take his time and not rush the decision. If he failed, he would be barred from retaking the test for a while, but the first attempt was always the safest way to test the waters. His mind drifted briefly to Lucille. She would have probably torn the whole place apart trying to figure out the door's secrets by now. Maybe I should just do it. The soft crackle of runic energy pulsed louder as he grasped the door's handle, twisting it. The door creaked open with an eerie but welcoming sound. With a deep breath, Robert stepped inside. A corridor stretched ahead of him, endless, it seemed. The air was thick with ancient power, and the stone walls were lined with more runes than he could count. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the door behind him slammed shut, leaving him no choice but to move forward. As he walked deeper into the corridor, he felt a strange pull. Not a danger, but a beckoning. A subtle force that tugged at him, leading him down the endless path. Time seemed to stretch and warp here. The stone underfoot remained the same, and yet the passage felt different, as though the very space around him was alive, breathing, watching him. Eventually, he reached the end of the corridor, where a grand set of doors awaited, twin obsidian gates inscribed with runes he didn't recognize. At that moment, he wished he had listened to Lucille when she had tried to teach him the basics of runes. While people like him couldn't directly read them, their shapes and colors usually hinted at their purpose. After taking a deep breath and steeling himself for whatever lay ahead, he pushed the heavy doors open. A bright light greeted him as he stepped forward, and in the next instant, he found himself in a new location. The ground beneath him felt like stone, reminiscent of a castle, as did the towering walls around him. A long, crimson carpet stretched out before him, leading toward another set of closed doors. The scene reminded him of the throne rooms depicted in paintings or the grand chambers reserved for powerful nobles, at least of ducal rank. I don't see any runic symbols anymore. Robert glanced around, trying to make sense of his situation. He soon realized that his clothing had changed. Instead of his previous attire, he now wore what resembled the underarmor of a knight, a blue gambeson, linen leggings, and thick leather boots. He seemed woefully under-equipped for battle, but before he could dwell on the thought, the sound of footsteps echoed from one of the side entrances. From the doorway emerged a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to the Arden Estate's head butler. "Sir Robert, you have arrived. My lord has been awaiting your arrival. Please, follow me." Robert nodded and allowed the butler to guide him forward. While the situation might seem strange, it was consistent with the other Ascension trials. In these illusory spaces, the people he encountered often took on the appearances of those he knew in real life. He had seen his brothers in the previous trial, so the presence of the Arden Estate's butler here wasn't particularly surprising. After what felt like several minutes of walking, they arrived at a massive set of ornate double doors. The butler stepped forward, pushing them open with surprising ease for their weight. As the doors parted, Robert was greeted by a sight that made his eyes widen. A grand throne room stretched before him, its scale beyond anything he had ever seen. The ceiling rose high, illuminated by chandeliers lined with floating crystals. A deep crimson carpet led to an elevated platform, upon which sat a throne forged from blackened steel, adorned with glowing runic etchings that pulsed with an otherworldly light. On that throne sat a man clad in a suit of runic armor, its design eerily similar to the one worn by Roland, his younger brother. The figure's presence was overwhelming. The runes on his armor shimmered and shifted as if alive, responding to his very breath. The helm, though obscuring his face, exuded an aura of authority. When he finally spoke, his voice caused his body to tremble as if he was speaking to some type of superior being. "You have come at last. My champion." The voice was deep, powerful, and resonated throughout the hall. Robert stiffened at the words, his mind struggling to catch up. However, the armored man's eyes continued to glow and he resumed. "The tournament is soon to begin, and you have been chosen. Prove your worth, and you shall take your rightful place at my table. Fail, and you shall be forgotten." Robert swallowed, his instincts telling him that this trial was unlike anything he had faced before. The previous trials had tested his skills in battle, his endurance, his tactics. But this felt different. It carried an air of something grander, something more meaningful. "You shall be given the tools necessary for your battles. The right weapon and armor to face your first opponent. Head to the fitting chambers, speak with the runesmith, and prepare thyself." The butler beside Robert gave a polite nod. "Come, Sir Robert. The runesmith awaits." Robert followed the butler through the grand corridors of the castle, his mind racing with thoughts of the trial ahead. The weight of the mysterious figure's words still lingered in his mind, "Prove your worth, or be forgotten." It felt as though the armored figure was telling him that this was the only way to progress in his life, or fail in his attempt to catch up to his brothers. The castle's architecture was breathtaking, walls lined with intricate carvings, archways stretching high above, and banners bearing unfamiliar symbols fluttering from the ceilings. Everything exuded an air of regality, but at the same time, there was something almost surreal about it. For a moment, Robert stopped to gaze out through one of the windows. From there, he had a clear view of the castle grounds and a nearby jousting arena. It was likely the place where he would soon face his opponent, one of many. He had no idea how many challengers awaited him, but he needed to determine whether this class was the right fit. Perhaps only after meeting the runesmith and engaging in battle would he understand how this class could benefit him and if it was compatible with his fighting style. Beyond the arena, a vast landscape stretched in all directions, an expanse of trees and fields of golden wheat. Yet, there were no farmers tending the crops, no soldiers patrolling the area. As always, this illusory space provided only the bare minimum required for the test. After turning away and resuming his walk, they arrived at another set of double doors, albeit much simpler than the ones leading to the throne room. The butler stepped forward, pushing them open to reveal a massive forge room. The air inside was thick with the scent of burning coal and molten metal, and the rhythmic clang of hammer against steel echoed throughout the chamber. Robert stepped inside, his gaze immediately falling upon the lone figure working at the anvil. The man was of sturdy build, his muscular arms moving with practiced precision as he shaped a glowing ingot with his hammer. Sweat glistened on his brow, and his leather apron bore countless scorch marks from years of toil. But what caught Robert off guard was the striking resemblance this man bore to Bernier, Roland's trusted assistant. "Ah, so you must be the one." The runesmith spoke without looking up, his voice deep and steady. "About time. The tournament waits for no man." Robert stepped closer, his eyes flicking to the many weapons and armor pieces neatly arranged around the forge. Each piece radiated magic, the unmistakable mark of rune-forged craftsmanship. Even as a warrior who had spent most of his life relying on physical strength and refined swordplay, he could not deny the allure of these enchanted tools. "Now, what do you wish to use?" "What do I wish to use? I can't craft the proper weapon and armor if you don't tell me what runic enchantments you favor, now can I?" The blacksmith turned to face him, his gaze intense. This was something new for Robert. He had never had the luxury of choosing his own equipment, always making do with whatever enchantments he could get his hands on. Even when Roland entered the picture, he had provided weapons for him, ones Robert used until they broke down before he reached his second-tier class. Now, this blacksmith who looked so much like Bernier, was asking him to decide. To tell him exactly what enchantments he preferred. Robert hesitated for a moment before finally asking a question. What sort of enchantments can you make, Runesmith? Ha! I can make all of them. Now, quickly, tell me what you need before the first bout begins. We don't have all day. Well, this might be a problem. Robert rubbed his head in contemplation. Before him lay swords of all shapes and sizes, armor, light, medium, heavy of varying designs. But the choice was his, and for once, he was expected to dictate the terms. A troublesome predicament indeed.